I had been planning this trip for months and I thought I had everything figured out. I wanted to get away from the city, from work, from the constant noise and pressure of daily life. I needed to be alone with nature, to see the woods and mountains the way I imagined them in my mind, untouched and silent. I had packed carefully: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, some dry food, water, a flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my backpack with a few other essentials. I even brought a notebook to write down my thoughts at night. It all felt like a perfect escape. A weekend alone where I could breathe and just exist. I drove for hours, leaving the city behind, the roads narrowing and twisting as I got into the foothills of the mountains. The GPS had stopped working properly somewhere along the way, so I had to rely on the map I printed out weeks earlier. The directions weren't perfect, but I liked it that way. I wanted to feel a little lost, to be immersed in the woods completely. Eventually, the road ended at a small gravel parking area. From there, a narrow dirt trail led into the forest. I parked my car, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and began the hike to the campsite I had chosen. The trail was rough, overgrown in some places, with roots and rocks hidden under fallen leaves. The smell of wet soil and decaying leaves was strong, and the air was cooler than I had expected, carrying the faint scent of pine and moss. I could hear the occasional bird, a woodpecker tapping in the distance, and the soft rustle of leaves as the wind blew. Everything seemed calm, almost serene. After a couple of hours, I reached a small clearing I had seen on the map. It was surrounded by tall trees, a mix of pines and oaks, their trunks thick and ancient. The ground was uneven, covered in layers of old leaves and pine needles. I found a spot that seemed flat enough to pitch my tent and began setting it up. The sun was already low, filtering through the trees in golden streaks. Setting up the tent was straightforward, but I made sure it was secure. The ground was soft, and I could feel the small stones and roots beneath my hands as I hammered the stakes. Once the tent was up, I unpacked my food and water. I had brought a small can of beans, some bread, a few energy bars, and a packet of instant coffee. I prepared a simple meal on my little stove sitting on a flat rock near my campsite. The first bite was satisfying. The food was basic, but it felt like a feast in that setting. I took my time, drinking water slowly, listening to the forest around me. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. A branch snapping somewhere, the distant call of a bird, the occasional rustle that could be an animal or just the wind. As night approached, I lit my flashlight and checked the area around my tent. I wanted to make sure there weren't any obvious hazards, like steep drop-offs or dead branches that could fall. Everything seemed okay. I went back inside my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and tried to relax. I wrote a few notes in my notebook about the day, about how alive and free I felt being away from civilization. The forest was dark now, thick with shadows, but the sounds were soothing rather than frightening. I thought I was ready to sleep. I didn't sleep. Not at first. Around midnight, I was woken by a sound outside the tent, something that didn't belong in the normal forest night. It was a low, dragging noise, something heavy being pulled across the ground. I froze, trying to tell myself it was just a branch or a rock rolling down a slope. But the sound was deliberate, slow, and methodical. It didn't move away. It moved closer. I could hear it shifting slightly, as if something large and heavy was moving around my campsite. My first thought was an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. I remembered the extra food I had in the tent, though I had kept it sealed. Still, I didn't want to take chances. I stayed completely still, holding my flashlight in my hand, trying not to make a sound. The dragging stopped for a few seconds, and then I heard another noise. A deep, muffled grunt, almost like a person straining with heavy weight. My heart started pounding. I told myself it had to be someone else hiking, someone lost, maybe someone who had gotten stuck or was moving a fallen tree. But the closer it got, the more I realized the trail to my campsite was narrow, difficult, and not easily passable at night. Someone walking quietly wouldn't make this much noise. I debated whether to leave my tent and confront whatever it was, but I didn't want to risk stepping outside into the dark where I couldn't see anything. I remembered I had my pocket knife in the tent. I gripped it, feeling a slight comfort from its weight. The dragging continued, stopping occasionally, then moving again, circling my tent slowly. I could hear branches breaking now, small cracks and snaps as the creature, or person, moved through the underbrush. My breathing became shallow and my mind raced through every possible explanation. I remembered something I had read about wildlife encounters in the woods. Most large animals avoid humans, but bears could be dangerous if provoked. A bear could make the grunting and dragging noise, but it would usually be searching for food, not moving in circles like this, and the sound wasn't right for a bear. Too steady, too controlled, like someone deliberately trying not to be noticed but failing. I sat in the tent for what felt like hours, listening. The forest seemed alive with faint movements, the occasional rustle of leaves far away, but the immediate area around my tent was tense, charged. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. I wanted to call for help, but my phone service was non-existent. I was completely alone. Eventually, the dragging stopped. Absolute silence followed, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I didn't move for a long time, afraid that any sound from me would draw attention. Then I heard it again, quieter this time, like someone walking on leaves, retreating slowly. I didn't breathe a sigh of relief until I was sure the noises had moved away from my immediate area. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting in the dark with my flashlight on intermittently, scanning the forest edges, listening for any sign that it had returned. The next morning I packed up quickly, eager to leave. I avoided the trail I had taken in, choosing a slightly longer route that followed a ridge. As I walked, I noticed signs of someone else's presence. Footprints in the soft earth, shallow but deliberate, weaving through the forest. Branches were bent in a way that suggested someone had moved through, dragging something heavy. My stomach churned. Whatever had been there the night before was not an animal. It had to be a person, a stranger, someone who didn't belong in these woods. I walked faster, my senses heightened. Every sound made me tense. Birds taking flight, the rustle of leaves under small animals, the whisper of wind through branches. All of it felt amplified. I was hyper-aware of the fact that I could be completely exposed at any moment, vulnerable to whoever had been circling my tent. After several hours, I reached a dirt road. I recognized it from my map. Relief washed over me as I started walking toward the nearest town, hoping to find help or at least a place to eat and rest. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I checked the back seat just to make sure no one had been following me, and finally felt some measure of safety. I started the engine and drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see a shadow in the trees. But there was nothing. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept thinking about the dragging sound, the grunting, the way it had circled my tent. It had felt deliberate, like someone knew exactly where I was, observing me, testing me. I called the local ranger station the next day and reported what had happened. They said it was possible someone was living illegally in the forest, moving from campsite to campsite, scavenging food, avoiding contact. They warned me to be careful and never camp alone in that area again. After that experience, I never went camping in remote, isolated spots alone. I stuck to established campgrounds where there were other people and ranger presence. I still loved the forest, but the sense of vulnerability I had felt that night stayed with me. It was a sharp, unforgettable lesson in how thin the line between calm wilderness and real danger can be. I realized that nature is unpredictable, but people are unpredictable in ways that are even harder to prepare for. I still think about that night, and I still remember the silence that followed the dragging, the pause before I dared to move, the quiet that pressed down on me as if the whole forest were holding its breath. I will never forget the weight of fear, the adrenaline, and the certainty that someone or something was watching me. And though it ended with me escaping, safe and alive, it left a mark that will never fade. A reminder that even in the most beautiful places, danger can hide just beyond the shadows. I learned to respect the woods in a new way, not just for their beauty, but for their unpredictability, and for the fact that humans can be as dangerous as any wild animal. That experience changed how I approached every outdoor trip afterward. I always made sure I wasn't alone, always checked my surroundings, always had a plan to escape. And I never ever forgot that night when I realized how exposed and vulnerable I had been waiting for months to take a solo camping trip. I'd been working long hours and needed a break from everything. No phone, no traffic, no people. Just me, the forest, and some quiet. I decided to go somewhere random. I opened Google Maps one night, zoomed into a mountain area I'd never been to before, and picked a small patch of green in the middle of nowhere. It didn't even have a name on the map, just a few winding trails and a lake nearby. That was enough for me. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, knife, some dry food, and 2 gallons of water. Sure, I had my flashlight, extra batteries, and my old camping stove. The plan was simple. Hike in, find a good spot near the water, set up camp, and spend 2 nights there. It sounded perfect. The drive took nearly 5 hours. Once I got off the main road, it turned into a dirt track full of rocks and potholes. I had to slow down to a crawl at some points, but I didn't mind. The trees got denser as I drove deeper in. The air got cooler, and the sound of civilization slowly disappeared. It was peaceful, but also a little unsettling. I realized I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. No phone signal either. I parked near a faded wooden sign that said, "No maintenance beyond this point." The trail was narrow and surrounded by tall pine trees. The smell of damp earth filled the air. It looked like no one had walked through here in months. I threw my backpack on, locked the car, and started walking. The first hour of hiking was easy. The path went slightly uphill, and sunlight filtered through the branches in golden streaks. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my boots crunching on leaves. After a while, I found a small clearing with a view of the lake below. It looked perfect for camping. The ground was level, and there were enough trees around to block any strong wind. I dropped my bag and started setting up the tent. It took me about half an hour to get everything in place. When I was done, I sat on a log, took out a bottle of water, and looked around. The air was still, and the forest had this strange silence that felt heavy. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was more like the kind of silence where your own heartbeat sounds too loud. I tried to shake off the feeling and decided to collect some firewood before it got dark. I wandered deeper into the trees, breaking off fallen branches and stuffing them into a bag. That's when I noticed something strange. About 50 feet away, I saw a small piece of fabric tangled on a bush. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, torn and dirty. It wasn't old enough to have been there for years. I picked it up and looked around, but there was nothing else. No backpack, no footprints, no sign of anyone. I tossed it aside and went back to camp. By the time the sun went down, I had a small fire going. The lake reflected the orange sky, and for a while everything felt calm again. I cooked some noodles on my small stove, ate quietly, and sat by the fire until the stars came out. The night was colder than I expected. The forest was completely dark beyond the glow of the flames. I lay down in my tent and listened to the fire crackle outside. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. It was dead quiet. The fire had burned out, and I could barely see anything. I felt an odd pressure in my chest, like I wasn't alone. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it. Something faint, like footsteps. Not close, but moving through the trees. Slow, uneven steps. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps stopped for a few seconds, then started again, circling slowly around where my tent was. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. The sound stopped completely after a minute or two. I waited, not daring to breathe too loud. After what felt like an hour, I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning I got up early. The ground outside the tent was damp with dew, and the air was cold enough to see my breath. I walked around the camp to check for tracks. About 10 feet away from my tent, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were footprints. Bare footprints. They were faint but clear in the soft dirt. Not animal prints. Human. They circled the tent once and then led off into the woods. They looked like they belonged to someone walking barefoot. I stood there for a long time staring at them. I didn't hear anything during the night after those steps stopped, so maybe it had just been someone passing through. But who walks barefoot in the middle of nowhere at night? I tried to calm myself down. Maybe a hiker lost their shoes or was camping nearby. I decided not to overthink it and went down to the lake to wash up. The water was freezing but refreshing. I stayed near the edge, looking at my reflection. The forest behind me looked endless. That day, I explored further around the lake, hoping to find some sign of another camper or trail, but I didn't find anything. Just thick woods, fallen trees, and animal droppings. No one had been here in a long time. When I returned to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something small near my tent. A stick was planted upright in the ground, about 6 inches tall. I was sure I hadn't put it there. It was just standing there like someone had pushed it into the dirt. I kicked it aside, trying not to freak out, but my stomach tightened again. I decided I'd stay one more night and leave early in the morning. I cooked another meal, packed most of my stuff, and tried to relax by the fire. But as the sky darkened, the forest began to feel different. The air was colder than before, and every sound made me tense up. The snapping of a twig, the rustling of leaves. When I finally got into the tent, I zipped it tight and lay still. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't turn it on. I wanted to fall asleep quickly. It didn't happen. I kept hearing faint sounds, branches creaking, something brushing against the tent, and then nothing. Hours passed like that. Then, close to dawn, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate steps, this time closer. My throat went dry. The sound stopped just outside the tent. I could hear breathing, slow, deep breathing. I didn't move a muscle. Whoever or whatever it was, it stood there for at least 30 seconds, maybe longer. Then, I heard the sound of feet walking away, slowly fading into the woods. When morning came, I packed up everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't even eat breakfast. When I stepped outside, the first thing I saw was the stick again, planted in the same spot as before, right next to my tent. Only this time it had something tied to it. A piece of dirty fabric, the same kind I'd seen hanging from the bush yesterday. That was it. I didn't even stop to think. I stuffed the rest of my gear into my backpack, put out the fire with a splash of lake water, and started walking back to the car. Every few minutes I'd look over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel something, like I was being watched. The hike back felt twice as long. The forest seemed darker even though it was daylight. Every shadow looked like someone standing there. My boots hit the trail fast, my breath heavy. I just wanted to reach the car. When I finally did, I threw my bag inside and started the engine immediately. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror once. At the edge of the trees, far in the distance, I saw a figure. It wasn't clear, just someone standing there still, watching the road. I didn't stop. I didn't even blink. I drove until I reached the main road, where I finally got a phone signal again. I pulled over, got out, and sat on the ground for a while, trying to calm down. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep properly. Every little noise at night made me think of that breathing sound outside the tent. I don't know who that person was or what they wanted. Maybe they were lost. Maybe they were living out there. But the thing that keeps bothering me is the footprints. They circled my tent perfectly, step by step, like someone had walked around it slowly, just watching. I've been camping since then, but only in places with other people around. I'll never go that deep into the woods again. Whatever was out there that night wasn't a ghost or some story to tell. It was something real, something human, and that's what makes it far worse. I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. I needed a break from the city, from noise, from people. I wanted silence, the kind of silence you can only find deep in the woods. I chose a remote forest area in northern Montana. It wasn't a marked campground, just a quiet spot I found through an online map and a few hiking forums. From the pictures, it looked peaceful, untouched, and perfect for solitude. I started early in the morning, loading my car with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, extra clothes, a small gas stove, and enough water for a few days. I checked everything twice. The drive took almost 6 hours, most of it through long, winding roads that cut through dense pine forests. As the hours passed, the road got narrower, and eventually it turned into a dirt path full of bumps and small rocks. I had to slow down to avoid damaging the car. By the time I reached the spot I had picked, the sun was low, throwing golden light through the trees. The place was beautiful. Tall pine trees stretching endlessly, the smell of damp earth, and the distant sound of a river. I parked the car beside a small clearing and decided that would be my base. I set up the tent, spread out my sleeping bag inside, and started a small fire before it got dark. That first night felt calm. The air was cold, but the fire kept me warm. I cooked a simple meal, sat beside the fire, and just listened. The forest was alive even at night. The sound of crickets, distant rustling, maybe animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, but also slightly eerie. There's something about the woods at night that makes you feel exposed, no matter how calm it seems. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange noise. It was faint but distinct, a rhythmic snapping sound like twigs breaking one after another. I froze in my sleeping bag listening. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I thought maybe it was a deer or maybe a raccoon rummaging around. I stayed quiet for a long time until the sound stopped. I fell back asleep eventually, though it took some time. The next morning I explored the area around my camp. About half a mile away I found a narrow trail that seemed old and unused. The ground was covered in pine needles and a few broken branches hung low, forcing me to bend as I walked. The trail led to a small riverbank. The water was clear and cold. I sat there for a while, eating an energy bar and watching the current. On my way back, I noticed something odd near the trees. Boot prints, faint but visible in the soft dirt. At first I thought they might be mine, but when I looked closer I realized they weren't. They were larger and the pattern was different. I hadn't seen any other cars or signs of people on the drive-in, so it made me curious. I followed them for a bit, but they seemed to come from deeper in the woods and looped around before disappearing near a patch of ferns. That evening, I built another fire. The temperature dropped quickly, and by 9 p.m. I was already zipped inside my tent. The forest grew darker than I expected, so dark that when I turned off my flashlight I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I tried to sleep, but the forest sounds kept me awake. Every rustle made me imagine something moving closer. At some point during the night I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate crunches in the dry leaves. They came from the direction of the river. My chest tightened as I lay still, not making a sound. The steps grew louder, then stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound. Nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind in the trees. After a long time, I heard the steps again, moving away. The next morning, I got up early and checked around my tent. There were footprints again, fresh ones, much clearer this time. They stopped a few feet away from where I had slept. I couldn't tell if they were human or something else, but they were big, almost twice the size of mine. My stomach sank. Someone or something had been standing right outside my tent. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe some hunter passing through, maybe an animal, but the idea of someone watching me while I slept stuck in my mind the whole day. I decided to stay one more night, then pack up in the morning. I had planned for 3 nights, but something about this place started to feel wrong. That afternoon, I went to collect more firewood. The forest seemed quieter than before. The usual chirping of birds had faded, and even the wind seemed still. As I bent to pick up some dry branches, I noticed something odd again. A tree nearby had deep marks carved into its trunk. Long, uneven scratches running down its side. They weren't natural. I touched one of the grooves. The wood felt fresh, splinters still sharp. When the sun started to go down, I felt uneasy. I built a bigger fire that night, hoping the light would keep animals away. I sat close to it for hours, not wanting to go inside the tent. The woods beyond the firelight looked endless, like they could swallow you whole if you took one wrong step. Around midnight, I started to hear faint sounds again. First the crunching of leaves, then something heavier. It wasn't random movement. It was slow, paced, like someone walking in circles around the clearing. My fire crackled softly, the only light for yards. I sat still, every muscle tense. The sound kept going, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never gone completely. After nearly an hour, it stopped. I waited another 20 minutes before finally crawling into the tent. I kept my knife beside me. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I decided I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could. The air was cold and still. As I loaded my gear into the car, I noticed movement in the trees behind the clearing. Just a flicker, like someone stepping back behind a trunk. I stared for a long time but saw nothing else. My hands were shaking when I started the car. The drive out felt longer than before. Every bump and shadow made me anxious. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror even though I knew it was pointless. After about 20 minutes, I stopped the car near a small clearing to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. There was something tied to a tree near the side of the road. A bundle of sticks crudely bound together with rope hanging from a branch. I got out to look. The sticks were arranged in a rough shape, almost like a figure with a few strands of what looked like hair tangled in the knots. It looked deliberately placed. I didn't touch it. I got back in the car and drove faster. The rest of the way I kept seeing odd signs, boot prints in the mud, broken branches, a piece of torn fabric hanging from a low branch. It all felt connected somehow, like I was being followed even though I couldn't see anyone. When I finally reached the paved road, I stopped again and looked back one last time. The forest looked calm and still, sunlight filtering through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been out there with me, moving quietly through the trees, watching from the shadows. I never went camping alone again after that. Weeks later, I was scrolling through a local forum about hiking and wilderness trips when I saw a post that made my stomach turn. Someone had written about a series of disappearances near the same area where I had camped. They mentioned finding abandoned campsites, tents ripped open, and gear scattered around. No one had been caught and no solid explanation was given. The boot prints I saw, the noises at night, the scratches on the tree. Everything made sense then, though in a way that made me feel sick. It wasn't animals or imagination. Someone had been there, maybe more than one person. I think about it sometimes, especially at night when the house is quiet. The sound of those footsteps still echoes in my head. The slow crunch of leaves, the stillness between each step, the way they stopped right outside my tent. I can still feel the air thick with silence, the kind that presses against your chest. It's strange how silence can become the loudest sound when you realize someone else is in it with you. I decided to go camping alone that weekend because I needed to clear my head. Work had been exhausting, and everything in my life felt too loud, too crowded. I wanted silence, the kind that only deep forests could offer. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, gas stove, flashlight, knife, and a small cooler with some food and water. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, only that I'd be gone for 2 days. It wasn't smart, but I'd camped enough times to feel confident. The spot I picked was deep in a national forest area in northern Montana. I had read about it on an old hiking forum, a clearing by a creek that wasn't marked on most maps but was known to be quiet and untouched. It sounded perfect. The drive took nearly 5 hours from where I lived, most of it through long, empty roads bordered by thick pines. The last 20 miles were on a rough gravel trail that my small SUV struggled with, bouncing hard over the rocks. I remember how the forest grew denser with every mile, branches hanging low, the light turning darker even though it was still afternoon. When I finally parked and got out, the air was cold and still. I could hear the creek faintly, So I followed that sound, dragging my backpack and gear through the brush until I found the clearing. It was small but beautiful. Soft moss covered the ground and the creek ran clear beside it, glittering in the weak sunlight. I set up my tent near the edge of the trees, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some dry branches for a small fire. That first evening was peaceful. I boiled some instant noodles, ate sitting on a log, and watched the sky shift into dark purple. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, birds calling, insects buzzing, the creek flowing. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I crawled into my sleeping bag and turned off my flashlight, staring at the tent ceiling until my eyes grew heavy. I woke up around midnight to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't an animal call. It was faint, irregular, like something soft brushing against fabric. I held my breath and listened again. Nothing. I told myself it was just branches shifting in the wind, but the air outside was still. I turned onto my side and tried to sleep again, though I noticed how my heart wouldn't slow down. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I made coffee, stretched my legs, and walked along the creek for a while. The air smelled damp and earthy, and I saw no one. No footprints, no old campsites, not even tire marks where I'd parked. The sense of isolation was both calming and slightly unsettling. Around noon, clouds rolled in and a light drizzle began. I retreated to my tent and spent the afternoon reading and dozing off to the sound of rain on the fabric. When the rain stopped near evening, I went out to collect more firewood. That's when I noticed it, a footprint in the mud near the edge of the clearing. It was larger than mine, and fresh. The water hadn't filled it in yet. I froze, staring at it for a long time. My first thought was that it had to be from another camper or a hiker, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone nearby. The print led from the forest toward the creek, but then disappeared where the ground turned to stones. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. People came and went from these woods all the time, even if rarely. Still, as I built the fire that night, I couldn't stop glancing into the trees. The woods were dark and quiet, the air still heavy after the rain. I ate quickly, extinguished the fire early, and went into my tent. The forest made small noises, twigs snapping, water trickling, but nothing unusual. I wrapped myself tightly in my sleeping bag and tried to push away the unease. Sometime during the night, I woke again. This time the sound was clearer, slow, deliberate footsteps in the mud outside my tent. They stopped, started again, then stopped once more. I could feel every muscle in my body tense. My tent was zipped shut and I didn't move. The footsteps circled once, then faded into the distance. I waited, eyes open, barely breathing, until exhaustion forced me back to sleep. When daylight came, I got out immediately. The ground outside was wet and I could see faint prints again, this time closer to my tent. They were deep, as if someone had stood there for a while. My stomach twisted. I scanned the woods, but there was nothing and only mist hanging between the trees. I debated packing up and leaving, but a stubborn part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a hunter, I thought. Maybe someone just passing by. I decided to stay one more night. I spent most of that day closer to the creek, fishing a little and keeping my ears open. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling, just the steady flow of water. Around dusk, I gathered my firewood early and lit the fire before dark. The smell of smoke and the flickering light made me feel a bit safer. I ate canned beans, sipped water, and tried to focus on the crackling flames instead of the darkness beyond them. By 9 p.m., I had zipped myself into the tent again. I left the flashlight beside me and tried to sleep, though it felt impossible. My ears caught every sound, every small shift in the air. At one point, I heard what sounded like a rock being thrown into the creek, then silence, then another one. It wasn't random. The splashes came seconds apart, like someone deliberately tossing them. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering. I reached for my knife and flashlight, unzipped the tent just an inch and peered out. The fire had gone down to glowing embers. The trees loomed like black walls. I couldn't see anything near the creek. I waited, watching, my breath fogging in the cold air. Then faintly I heard movement, branches shifting, the crunch of wet soil. I turned my light toward it, but caught only a glimpse of something pale disappearing behind a tree. I pulled the zipper shut again and sat there, gripping the knife, my back against the tent wall. I didn't sleep that night. Every few minutes I'd hear something faint. A twig breaking, soft steps circling. By dawn I felt half delirious. The forest was covered in fog when I stepped out. I packed my gear fast, barely taking time to eat. My hands were shaking as I tore down the tent. When I looked toward the tree line one last time, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A makeshift shelter. Branches leaned together with a tarp half buried under leaves, maybe 50 feet away. I hadn't seen it before. It blended too well with the forest. I stood there staring at it, realizing someone had been living close to me the entire time. My mind raced with what could have happened if I had stayed another night. I forced myself to turn away, loaded everything into my backpack, and started walking fast toward where I'd parked. The forest felt different now, the heavy watching. Every sound made me flinch. My boots slid in the mud as I hurried along the path, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. When I reached the car, the relief I felt was mixed with dread. The passenger side door was open. Not wide, but just enough to notice. I knew I had locked it before. My hands trembled as I opened it wider. Inside, my glove box was hanging open, papers scattered. Nothing was missing, but it was obvious someone had been there. I started the engine and didn't look back. The drive out felt endless, and every shadow along the road made my chest tighten. When I finally reached the main highway, I stopped at a gas station and sat there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I might have been to danger without realizing it. Whoever was out there, they weren't trying to scare me, though. They were watching. Maybe waiting. I kept replaying the sounds from those nights, the footprints, the open car door. I never went back to that area again, and I deleted the forum where I had found it. Months later, out of curiosity, I checked online for reports about the same region. There were a few posts from other campers, people mentioning hearing footsteps, finding food wrappers that weren't theirs, or coming across hidden shelters in the woods. Some even found traps or animal bones hung in trees. It made me realize how easy it is to vanish out there without anyone knowing. How close I came to being one of those stories people read about online. A missing camper last seen near a quiet creek in Montana. I still camp sometimes, but only at public sites now. I keep my phone on, my car nearby, and I never ever spend a night alone deep in the woods again. The silence I used to crave now feels dangerous. It reminds me of that forest, the one where something human but not quite safe walked just outside my tent. It was early September when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd been working non-stop for months, sitting behind a screen every day, barely getting out of the apartment. I felt drained, almost like my body needed to touch dirt, air, and silence again. So I packed up my gear, tent, sleeping bag, small gas stove, a few cans of food, water, flashlight, knife, and a cheap camera, and drove north toward the state forest that bordered the mountains. I didn't have a plan or a marked trail in mind. I just wanted to find some quiet space where I wouldn't hear traffic or see people. By the time I reached the forest, the afternoon sun was sitting low. I parked at the edge of a long dirt road that cut deep into the woods. The area wasn't a designated campground, which meant no other campers, no signs, no rangers. Just miles of thick forest and uneven trails. That was what I wanted. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started walking, until I found a small clearing beside a stream, hidden between tall pines and birch trees. The ground was dry and soft with fallen needles. I decided that would be home for the night. Setting up the tent took about 20 minutes. I gathered some firewood, cleared an area for the fire pit, and boiled water for instant noodles. The sound of the stream beside me was calm and steady, like a quiet hum that filled the silence. I remember feeling completely at peace. No voices, no car engines, no buzzing notifications. Just stillness. As the light faded, I lit the campfire. The warmth of it against the cooling air felt good. I sat there for hours, watching the orange flames curl upward, listening to the subtle sounds of the woods. A branch snapping somewhere, the rustle of a small animal, the breeze brushing through the leaves. Everything felt normal, calm, the way nature should. When I finally decided to sleep, it was close to midnight. The fire had dimmed to red embers. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and lay back, staring at the nylon ceiling that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The forest outside was alive but quiet, small insects buzzing, the distant call of an owl, the flow of water. My mind began to slow down. I drifted somewhere between being awake and asleep. Sometime later, I couldn't tell how long, I woke up suddenly. There was no noise at first, just the feeling that something had changed. I sat still, my heartbeat quickening, trying to understand why I was awake. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound coming from the direction of the stream. It was like splashing, steady and heavy, as if someone was stepping slowly through shallow water. At first I thought it might be a deer. They often cross streams at night, but then I realized the pattern was wrong. It wasn't the fast, uneven steps of an animal. It sounded deliberate. One step, pause, another step, pause. Slow and heavy, like a person walking carefully through the water. I stayed still, not daring to move. The sound grew a little louder, closer. Then it stopped. Complete silence followed. The kind that presses against your ears and makes your breathing sound too loud. I could feel my pulse beating in my neck. After what felt like a long minute, I heard the sound of water dripping, faint but near. Then soft, deliberate movement through the grass, getting closer to my tent. I reached for the knife that I had kept beside my sleeping bag. My fingers were trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. I kept my eyes on the tent wall, trying to see any shadow, any movement. Then I heard the faint crunch of leaves. Someone or something was standing just outside my tent. The sound was right there. For several minutes, nothing happened. I barely breathed. Then slowly, the sound of retreating steps moved away, back toward the stream, into the trees, fading until the forest was silent again. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I just lay there, gripping the knife, waiting for dawn. When light finally filtered through the tent, I stepped outside. The air was cold and damp. I looked around carefully. The grass near the tent was flattened in a few places, as if someone had stood there. I followed the marks toward the stream. The ground near the water was muddy, and there were clear footprints. Human, barefoot. The prints came from the other side of the stream and stopped right at the edge near my camp. Whoever it was had stood there facing my tent for some time. Then the prints turned and went back the way they came. I felt uneasy, but I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe a hiker, maybe someone living off-grid nearby, maybe even a fisherman who wandered too far. I decided to stay one more night just to prove to myself that I wasn't overreacting. I spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, hoping to find signs of another camp or people. But I found nothing. The trails were overgrown, the forest dense and quiet. When I got back to my site before sunset, I noticed something strange. My backpack had been moved. It was subtle. I had left it under a tree, and now it was sitting a few feet away. Nothing was missing, but one of the zippers was open. My stomach sank. Someone had definitely been there while I was gone. I rebuilt the fire and kept it burning high. The comfort of light helped, but there was a heavy feeling in the air, like being watched. Every sound in the forest made me turn my head. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food, and sat beside the fire until my eyes burned from exhaustion. I didn't want to sleep, but I couldn't keep them open forever. I finally went into the tent around midnight again, leaving the fire low but alive. I lay on my side, facing the zipper, knife in hand. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No insects, no night birds, just stillness. My breathing felt loud. Sometime in the night, I woke again. There was no sound, no movement, just a strange, heavy silence. Then I noticed the faint smell of smoke. Not from my campfire, but old smoke, like burnt wood long gone cold. I sat up, my heart hammering. The air felt off, heavier somehow. I unzipped the tent slightly to peek outside. The fire had burned out completely, but the moonlight lit the clearing enough to see. That's when I noticed it. Something dark lying on the other side of the stream. At first I thought it was a log, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see it was something man-made. A small structure, maybe an old cabin or shed, half collapsed and covered in moss. I hadn't noticed it before. even though I'd been near the stream several times. It must have been hidden behind the brush and shadows. I didn't sleep much after that. As soon as dawn broke, I decided to check it out. The structure was about 20 feet from the water, built from rough, rotting timber. The door was gone, the roof caved in. Inside were rusted metal cans, broken glass, a few old tools. It looked abandoned for decades. But the dirt floor had recent footprints, bare feet again, the same size as the ones I saw near my tent. I backed away slowly, feeling the air tighten around me. My mind started racing. If someone was living here, why were they sneaking to my camp at night? Why not just approach during the day? Why barefoot? I packed my things in less than 10 minutes. The only thought in my head was to get out. The hike back to my car felt endless. The forest that had felt peaceful now felt like it was closing in. Every sound made me flinch, a twig breaking, a bird flying up, leaves rustling. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my car, I almost ran the last few steps. I threw my gear into the back seat and started the engine, heart still pounding. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road. I didn't. But the feeling that I was being watched didn't leave until I reached the main highway. When I got home that evening, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to look up the forest on my computer, searching for any mention of cabins or missing hikers. After a few searches, I found an old article from the early 2000s. It mentioned that a man had once lived deep in those woods, in an illegal makeshift shack near a stream. He had been wanted for a string of break-ins and disappearances around nearby campsites, but was never caught. Authorities believed he either fled or died out there. The article described the area, the stream, the unmarked trails, the collapsed cabin. It was the same place. That night I sat staring at my packed gear in the corner of the room, still covered in forest dust. I thought about those footprints, the quiet movements, the feeling of being watched through the tent fabric. I realized that whoever had been out there probably never left. I haven't gone camping alone since then. Sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the slow steps in the stream, one after another, followed by silence. The same silence that still makes my chest tighten every time I think about it. I went camping alone deep in the mountains last summer. I didn't plan it carefully, and honestly, that was my mistake from the start. I had been going through a stressful few months and wanted to get away from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. I picked a random area on the map, somewhere far from the main trails, surrounded by thick forest and steep valleys. The kind of place where silence feels heavy. The drive there took almost 6 hours. The last 40 minutes were on a rough dirt road that kept narrowing until I had to stop. I parked near a small clearing and decided to hike the rest of the way. The air was warm but still, and I could hear nothing but the faint hum of insects. I remember how quiet it was. Even the wind seemed absent. I walked for about 2 hours through dense woods until I found a flat spot near a small creek. The ground was soft and there were no signs of people around. It felt isolated, exactly what I wanted. I set up my small one-person tent, unpacked my gear, and built a fire ring from rocks. The first night went by peacefully. I cooked a can of soup over the fire, listened to the creek running nearby, and felt a strange kind of calm that I hadn't felt in months. But the peace didn't last. The second day, I explored the surrounding area. I followed the creek upstream for about a mile. The forest became denser the farther I went, and the terrain turned uneven. There were huge trees covered in moss, fallen trunks rotting away, and small animal tracks pressed into the mud. I noticed a faint smell in the air, not strong but sharp and sour, like something decaying. I assumed it was a dead animal somewhere close by. It didn't bother me much, but I didn't stay long. When I returned to camp that evening, I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I had left zipped up inside the tent, was half open. I thought maybe I hadn't closed it properly, but some of my food was missing. A granola bar, a small packet of jerky, and an apple were gone. I figured it was a raccoon or squirrel that had somehow gotten in. I cleaned up, double-checked the zippers, and hung the rest of my food from a tree branch just in case. That night I couldn't sleep well. Around midnight I heard faint rustling sounds near the tent. They came and went in short bursts, followed by silence. I stayed still, listening carefully. The noises sounded too heavy to be a small animal. Something was moving slowly through the brush, just outside the circle of my campfire's glow. I didn't move or make a sound, just stared at the thin nylon wall of my tent, waiting. After a few minutes, the noises stopped completely. I told myself it was just deer. The next morning, I found more signs that something had been there. The ashes around the fire pit were disturbed, and there were small impressions in the dirt nearby. They weren't clear footprints, more like scuff marks. Something or someone had definitely walked around my camp. I tried not to overthink it. The nearest town was almost 20 miles away. It didn't make sense that a person would be wandering out there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to stay one more night before heading back. I spent most of the day gathering firewood and refilling my water bottles from the creek. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement between the trees. Just small flickers, like someone stepping out of sight. I blamed my nerves. Isolation can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're not used to it. As the sun went down, I built a larger fire than usual. The light made me feel safer. I sat by it, staring at the flames, eating the last of my food. The woods around me grew darker until I could barely make out the shapes of the trees. The air turned colder, and the forest went silent again. Not a single sound. Then I heard something from the direction of the creek. A soft splash followed by the sound of wet footsteps. I froze. The steps were slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully through shallow water. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but the beam didn't reach far enough. I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped as soon as I aimed the light. I waited for a long time before going back inside my tent. I kept the flashlight beside me, but sleep wouldn't come. Every tiny noise outside made me tense up. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint metallic sound, like something brushing against my carabiner or the metal buckle of my backpack. Then came the unmistakable sound of breathing. It was slow and uneven, just outside the tent wall. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move an inch. The breathing continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. I waited in complete silence. I could hear nothing after that. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. I stayed awake until sunrise. When I finally stepped out of the tent, the first thing I noticed was that the rope I had used to hang my food was cut. Not chewed, cut cleanly. The remaining end dangled from the branch, smooth as if sliced by a knife. My food bag was gone. That's when it hit me that it couldn't have been an animal. Someone had been there. I packed up immediately. My hands were shaking while I tore down the tent and stuffed everything into my backpack. I didn't bother cooking breakfast or checking the area. I just wanted to leave. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. I kept turning around, sure I'd see someone following me. When I reached the clearing where I had parked, my stomach dropped. My car door was open. Not broken into, just open. I know I had locked it before leaving. I checked inside and saw that the glove box was open and everything inside was scattered. Nothing valuable was missing. But my map, my lighter, and a small pocket knife I kept in the console were gone. That detail stayed with me. The missing knife. I started the car and drove as fast as the dirt road allowed. My hands were sweating so badly that I had to wipe them on my jeans to keep my grip on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop thinking about that campsite, about the quietness, the breathing, the cut rope. I checked the local news for days after, expecting maybe to hear about a missing person or a police search in that area. Nothing ever came up. A week later, I went through my gear and found something that made my blood run cold. Inside one of the side pockets of my backpack, the one I rarely used, there was a small folded piece of paper. I didn't remember putting it there. My first thought was that it must have fallen in by accident, but when I unfolded it, I saw a simple message written in pencil. It said, "Don't come back." No signature, no marks, nothing else. Just those 3 words written neatly in the center of the paper. I threw the backpack away that same night. To this day, I don't know who was out there. I've replayed every second of that trip in my mind. How they could have watched me, how they could have approached so silently. Maybe they were already living in those woods, far from anyone. Maybe they were hunting or hiding or doing something worse. All I know is that someone was there the whole time and they wanted me gone. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, when I drive past the edge of a forest, I feel the same chill in my chest. It's not fear of animals or weather. It's the fear of knowing that someone could be out there watching quietly, waiting in the silence where no one would ever find them. And that thought has stayed with me every night since. I went camping alone deep in the northern woods, far away from any marked trail or campground. I had always wanted to try a full solo trip. No phones, no contact, no noise from other campers. Just me, a tent, and the forest. I had planned for this trip for weeks. I made sure my backpack had everything I needed. Food for 3 days, a sleeping bag, tent, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and a small axe. I parked my car near an old logging road that was no longer in use and hiked about 3 hours into the woods before setting up camp near a slow-moving stream. The area felt untouched, quiet in a way that made you feel small. The first day went fine. I spent most of it setting up the tent, collecting firewood, and finding a good place to get water. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and every sound carried through the trees. The flap of wings, the crack of branches, the hum of insects. I cooked instant noodles over the fire that night and watched the orange glow dance against the dark woods. When night came, it got colder than I expected. The firelight flickered across the trees and the shadows stretched long and strange. I heard something far off, maybe a branch snapping or a small animal moving, but it didn't bother me. Animals were normal here. I turned in early, the forest around me quiet except for the wind and a few crickets. The silence was heavy, and I remember thinking how still everything felt. The second day I hiked around the area. The land was uneven, full of thick underbrush and fallen logs. I found what looked like an old hunting blind made from rotted wood, almost hidden by vines. It must have been there for years. I walked further up a slope, where the ground was covered in a layer of wet leaves that made every step slick. From the top I could see miles of forest, endless green fading into blue haze. It felt freeing, like I was completely alone in a place no one had touched in years. By afternoon I was tired, so I went back to camp. That's when I noticed something strange. The fire pit I had made was scattered, stones pushed aside, ashes spread out. My food bag had fallen over too, though it was hanging from a branch when I left it. I assumed maybe an animal had gotten curious, maybe a raccoon or squirrel. Nothing looked stolen, just disturbed. Still, it made me uneasy. I rebuilt the fire pit and tied my food higher. That night, the woods felt different. The air seemed thicker, heavier. The sound of insects had faded almost completely, replaced by long stretches of silence broken only by small noises, tiny cracks, and faint movement. I tried not to think much of it, telling myself animals were just passing through. Sometime late at night, I woke up. I didn't know why. I just opened my eyes to darkness and a strange stillness. My fire had gone out completely, but there was a faint light from the moon slipping through the branches. Then I heard it and a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. It wasn't close, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, but it was steady, like something walking. I lay still, breathing shallow, waiting for it to stop. It didn't. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam caught nothing but trees. The sound stopped right after I did. I waited for a few minutes, then turned off the light. The silence came back, thicker than before. I didn't sleep again that night. When morning came, I checked around the area. I saw faint footprints in the damp dirt near my camp, larger than mine and not from any animal I knew. They looked human. Bare feet, long steps, the dirt pressed deep like someone had been standing there for a while. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was from some hiker who passed through, though I hadn't seen a single sign of anyone for miles. The idea of someone wandering around my camp while I slept made my stomach twist. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it felt stupid to panic without proof. I decided to stay one more night and leave early the next morning. I moved my camp closer to the stream, hoping the sound of running water would help me sleep. That afternoon I noticed something else. Small things missing. My lighter, a spoon, and one of my socks were gone. I searched the whole area but found nothing. It was strange because I kept all my stuff close. I didn't hear or see anyone. I told myself I must have misplaced them, but that didn't make sense either. By evening I built a larger fire. The woods looked darker that night, almost like the trees were pressing in closer. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up every time I moved. I sat near the fire for hours trying to stay calm. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the flashlight on next to me. It must have been around midnight when I heard it again. Slow footsteps. But this time they were closer. I froze, listening. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, low and uneven. My heart started pounding so hard I thought whoever it was could hear it. I stayed completely still, trying to convince myself it was a deer, but I knew it wasn't. The breathing was too slow, too human. Then I heard something brush lightly against the tent fabric, like a hand running down it. I wanted to grab my knife, but I was scared the sound would give me away. The breathing stopped. A few seconds later, I heard retreating steps, slow at first, then faster, fading into the woods. I lay awake until dawn, gripping the knife in my hand. When the light came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. There were fresh footprints in the mud, clear and human. I followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into the undergrowth. Whoever it was had come from the direction opposite the road, deeper into the forest. That meant they weren't just passing through. They had been watching me. I didn't even eat breakfast. I started packing everything as fast as I could. While I was rolling my tent, I saw something hanging from a low branch nearby. My missing sock tied in a knot. It was filthy, covered in mud. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever had been there wasn't just watching. They had gone through my stuff, touched it, maybe while I was sleeping. I threw everything into my pack and started hiking back the way I came. The forest was silent again, not even the sound of birds. Every few minutes I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. I moved as fast as I could, but the trail I had made 2 days ago wasn't clear anymore. I must have taken a wrong turn because soon the trees around me looked unfamiliar. Panic started creeping in. I tried using the sun to guide myself west toward the road, but the canopy was thick and light came in broken patches. My legs ached, my shirt was soaked in sweat, and I hadn't eaten since morning. Hours passed. The forest didn't seem to end. I stopped to rest near a large fallen tree, breathing hard. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Small carvings on the trunk. Lines, shapes, rough marks made with something sharp. They weren't natural. Someone had been marking this tree, maybe recently. I moved on, pushing through brush until I saw another mark, this time on a standing tree. It was the same symbol carved deep into the bark. I realized then that I wasn't lost randomly. I was walking in circles right through an area someone had marked. The light started fading fast. I didn't want to stop, but I knew hiking in darkness would be worse. I set up my tent quickly, too tired to think. I didn't even build a fire this time. I just zipped myself inside and waited for morning. The night was long. Every sound made me jump. I thought I heard faint footsteps again, but they came and went, blending into the rustle of leaves. My body wouldn't relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just beyond the thin tent wall waiting. When dawn came, I left everything except the essentials: water, knife, and a bit of food and cam, and started walking again. After hours of moving west, I finally heard something that made my chest tighten. The distant sound of a car engine. I followed it, crashing through the woods until I saw the faint glint of metal through the trees. My car. I stumbled toward it, threw my gear inside, and started the engine with shaking hands. I didn't even check behind me as I drove off. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over to catch my breath. My hands were trembling. I looked at my reflection in the side mirror. Dirt on my face, red eyes, exhaustion carved deep into my features. Then I noticed something that froze me again. On the passenger side mirror, Someone had smeared something, a dark streak like mud, or maybe something else. I wiped it off with my sleeve and saw faint marks beneath it, small scratches, almost like letters. I couldn't tell what they said, but the thought of someone being close enough to touch my car made my stomach twist again. I drove straight home and didn't stop for anything. For days afterward, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those footprints, that breathing outside my tent, the missing items, and the marks on the trees. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. Someone had been out there, someone who watched, waited, and followed. I never went back to that forest. Even now, when I see a tree line at dusk or hear the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, I feel that same cold weight in my chest. Because the worst part wasn't what happened out there. The worst part was realizing that whoever was there probably knew I was leaving, and chose to let me go. I went camping alone last summer, deep in a forested area about 2 hours from my town. I'd been feeling burned out from work and wanted peace, no phones, no traffic, no people. I picked a random spot on a topographic map, somewhere between two small lakes, surrounded by hills and thick pine woods. It looked perfect. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, a hatchet, and my camera. My plan was to stay for 3 nights just to reset myself. The drive there was long but beautiful. The road gradually narrowed into gravel, then into a rough dirt path that wound through miles of forest. I parked at the end of a small clearing and walked about a mile into the woods with my gear. The air smelled sharp and clean, full of pine and damp soil. The quiet was immediate. The kind that presses against your ears until you realize you can hear your own heartbeat. I set up camp beside a shallow stream. The spot was flat and soft, with moss covering most of the ground. There were animal tracks around, probably deer. I could tell the place wasn't used often by people. There were no beer cans, no fire rings, not even old footprints. It felt untouched, like time slowed down there. I pitched my tent facing the stream and collected dry branches for a small fire. The afternoon light filtered through the trees, creating a pattern of shadows that kept shifting as the wind blew. I sat by the fire, heating up beans from a can, just listening. The woods had a rhythm to them, the distant call of a crow, the crackle of the fire, the steady trickle of water nearby. That first night went quietly. I fell asleep early and woke only once when I heard what sounded like branches snapping somewhere behind the tent. It wasn't too close, but close enough to jolt me awake. I listened for a while and heard nothing else, so I went back to sleep. The next morning I explored deeper into the forest. The ground sloped upward toward a ridge, and from there I could see the 2 lakes shining through the trees. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, no sign of human presence. I found what looked like old logging equipment, a rusted saw blade half buried in the dirt and a few metal parts eaten by moss. Probably left decades ago. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already tilting west. I gathered more firewood and made a small meal. I noticed something odd, though. A few of the small branches I had placed near the fire pit the day before were gone. I thought maybe an animal dragged them off, but the ends weren't chewed. They were just gone. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night I woke up again to noises. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. The forest was black and I could hear movement, slow, deliberate, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the tent. The sound of something walking. Not running, not rushing, just walking. The steps were spaced out, heavy, not the quick scurrying of an animal. I lay completely still, barely breathing. The fire had died out and the moonlight was faint through the trees. I listened for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then the footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep after that. When dawn came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, half expecting to see someone standing there. There was nothing, but I did notice fresh prints in the soft dirt near the stream. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints, large ones. That discovery changed everything. Up until that point, I felt relaxed, alone, safe even. But knowing someone else had been close enough to my tent in the night, without saying anything, put a weight in my stomach. I tried to convince myself maybe it was a hunter or another camper, but I hadn't seen a single sign of anyone since arriving. and there were no campsites nearby. I decided to move my camp farther down the stream, closer to where I had parked. I didn't want to pack up completely. I still had 2 nights left, but I needed to feel less isolated. I hiked maybe half a mile and set up a new spot near a bend in the stream where the trees opened slightly, allowing more light in. I could see the ridge from there. That evening I was extra careful. I built a strong fire and stacked a small pile of rocks around it, just in case I needed something to grab if I felt threatened. I ate, wrote a few notes in my camping journal, and tried to calm down. The woods were silent again except for crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. At some point, I must have drifted to sleep. But later the same sound returned, slow footsteps. This time they were closer. I stayed absolutely still, staring at the faint outline of the tent fabric glowing from the dying fire outside. I could hear breathing, slow, deep breathing. It wasn't mine. It came from just beyond the tent wall. I reached quietly for the hatchet I kept beside my sleeping bag. My hand shook. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. A moment later, something brushed against the side of the tent. A slow drag, like a hand or an object sliding down the fabric. My entire body froze. I couldn't hear footsteps leaving, but after a while, the sound faded. I waited until the first light of dawn before stepping outside. The ground was damp from dew. The fire was just ashes. But I saw clear signs, boot prints circling the tent. And something else. A small pile of stones had been stacked near the stream in a rough pyramid shape. I hadn't done that. At that point, I made up my mind to leave that day. I started packing my things as fast as I could. My nerves were shot. Every sound made me turn. When I walked toward where my car was parked, I realized something that made my chest tighten. The boot prints followed the same direction, toward the trail I'd come in from. Whoever it was had been moving around my area, watching maybe. The trail back to the clearing was quiet, but the sense of being followed never left me. Every few minutes I stopped and looked behind. Nothing. But then when I was about halfway there, I noticed something on the ground. A torn piece of fabric. Blue with a bit of dirt on it. It looked like it came from a jacket. It wasn't mine. When I reached the clearing where my car was parked, I felt a wave of relief. But that relief didn't last long. The passenger door of my car was open. I was sure I had locked it. Inside, everything was tossed around, my first aid kit, my maps, my spare flashlight. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been disturbed, as if someone had been searching for something. That moment broke whatever sense of calm I had left. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove out of there without even looking back. The dirt road twisted through the forest, and the trees seemed to close in as I went. It felt like escaping from something unseen. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat there for several minutes just trying to breathe. My hands were shaking on the wheel. The woods were silent behind me, the way they always are from a distance, calm and beautiful. But I knew better now. I knew there was someone out there, someone who liked that kind of silence too much. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, that breathing, that hand against my tent. I kept wondering if I'd crossed paths with some hermit living deep in those woods, or maybe a drifter hiding out. Someone who didn't want to be found. A week later, I looked up the area online, just out of curiosity. I found a few old reports, missing hikers, a couple of unconfirmed sightings of an abandoned cabin somewhere near the lakes, and one incident where a camper's gear was found torn apart, but no one ever identified who did it. None of it made sense, but it was enough for me to know I hadn't imagined what happened. Now I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never without checking the area carefully first. People always say the woods are peaceful, but peace depends on who else is sharing that silence with you. Out there, alone in the dark, it's easy to forget how big the forest really is, and how easy it is for someone to watch you from just beyond the trees, without you ever knowing they're there. That thought has stayed with me ever since. I went camping alone deep in the forest one weekend in late September. The air had that mix of warmth from the day and the chill that creeps in once the sun drops. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road and hiked nearly 2 hours to reach a quiet clearing beside a stream. I wanted silence, no people, no phones, just peace. By evening, I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal. The forest was calm, but as darkness settled, I began to notice faint noises, twigs snapping, footsteps that didn't sound like mine. I told myself it was probably deer or raccoons, but the sounds got closer, slower, more deliberate. I used my flashlight to scan the trees, but every time I turned toward the noise, it stopped. I felt watched. My heartbeat got louder than the forest itself. I decided to stay awake by the fire, but around midnight the wood ran out. I went a few meters to gather more and saw something that froze me. A small campfire in the distance. It wasn't there before. No one was supposed to be out here. I had checked the area's permits, completely empty that weekend. The fire flickered low, and I could barely make out movement beside it. It looked like a man crouching. I quietly backed away, heart pounding. I didn't want to make noise, didn't even breathe properly until I was back in my tent. The rest of the night was hell. I heard soft crunching in the leaves nearby, sometimes too close. I kept my knife ready and didn't sleep at all. Around dawn, everything went silent again. When the light returned, I packed up immediately. As I hiked back toward the trail, I passed the spot where I thought I'd seen that other fire. The ground was charred, the remains of ashes still warm, but there were footprints leading away into the woods. Those prints followed my trail for nearly half a mile before turning back. Whoever had been there had walked the same path I took in, staying just out of sight the entire time. When I reached my car, there was a muddy handprint on the driver's door. No valuables were missing, no scratches, just that single print. I drove straight home and never went camping alone again. I had been wanting to camp alone for a long time. There was something about the idea of being completely disconnected from everything. No phone, no noise, no people. That felt peaceful. I had done plenty of camping before, but always with friends or family. This time I wanted to test myself, to see how it would feel being completely alone in the woods for a few days. I picked a random forested area about 2 hours away from where I lived. A quiet stretch of land near an old logging road. It wasn't an official campsite, but I knew how to handle myself outdoors, so I didn't think much of it. The drive there was calm. The air smelled like pine and damp earth as I rolled down the windows. I could see the trees getting thicker the further I went, and the sun was just starting to set behind the hills. By the time I reached the end of the dirt road, it was almost dusk. I parked the car on a small patch of gravel and loaded my backpack, tent, and supplies onto my shoulders. The sound of my boots crunching on the dry leaves echoed through the silence. I walked for maybe an hour before finding a spot that felt right. It was a flat piece of ground surrounded by tall trees, with a small creek running about 20 yards away. The air was still except for the faint sound of running water and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. It wasn't much, but out there it tasted better than any restaurant meal. The sky turned dark, and the forest around me fell into that deep quiet that only woods at night can have. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the forest. Crickets chirping, leaves moving, the sound of water flowing nearby. It was peaceful, but after a while I noticed how absolute the silence could become. Every tiny sound seemed louder than it should have been. I heard a twig snap once, maybe 100 feet away, then nothing. My heart jumped a little, but I reminded myself that it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Still, I stayed awake longer than I planned, waiting for more noise. Nothing came. The next morning, the forest looked different. The fog hung low between the trees and everything was wet with dew. I boiled some instant coffee on my little stove and sat on a log, staring at the mist. It was quiet again, almost too quiet. No birds, no movement, just a thick silence. After breakfast, I decided to explore a little. I followed the creek downstream, watching the way it twisted through the forest. The ground was soft, covered with moss and pine needles. At one point, I came across what looked like an old trail, mostly overgrown. It led deeper into the woods, away from the creek. Curiosity got the best of me. I followed the trail, stepping over fallen branches and rotting logs. After about half an hour, I found something strange. An old campsite. There was a rusted metal frame that looked like what used to be part of a tent, some crushed cans and the remains of a campfire ring. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I crouched to take a closer look. Everything was covered in dirt and leaves, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't that old, maybe a few years, but still fresh enough that someone had once been there not too long ago. I stood there for a while, just staring at the remnants. There was no reason to feel nervous, but I did. Something about the scene felt wrong, like it had been left in a hurry. I walked back to my own camp slowly, my mind replaying what I'd seen. The air felt heavier now. By afternoon, the forest started to feel less inviting. The light that came through the trees looked weaker, almost grayish. I spent the day gathering more firewood and sitting by the creek, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I looked into the trees, I thought I saw movement. Not people, not animals, just quick shadows between the trunks. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As night came again, the air grew colder. I built a larger fire than usual, partly to stay warm and partly because I didn't like how dark the forest became once the sun went down. The glow from the flames created long shadows that danced around me. I ate my dinner in silence, staring at the fire, listening. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't an animal. It was heavier, slower, like footsteps. I froze in my sleeping bag. The fire had burned down to embers and the light was faint. I could barely see beyond the entrance of my tent. The sound came again, leaves crunching under weight. It stopped for a few seconds, then started again, closer this time. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Nothing but silence again. I waited for what felt like an hour, my muscles tense, before I dared to look outside. The air was freezing as I unzipped the tent slowly. The firelight flickered weakly and I saw nothing. Just trees and darkness. The next morning I found tracks in the soft ground near my tent. Not boots, not shoes, barefoot but large. The kind of footprints that shouldn't have been there. They led from the edge of the woods to the creek and disappeared in the mud. I stood there staring at them for a long time. I didn't know what to think. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had been hiking through the area, but I knew how unlikely that was. This place was miles away from the nearest trail. All day I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept scanning the woods, expecting to see someone watching me. I didn't, but that didn't make me feel better. That night I built my fire even bigger, stacking logs high. I sat close to it, keeping my flashlight beside me. Every rustle made me flinch. Every gust of wind made me turn my head. It was around midnight when I smelled something strange. It was faint, like old smoke mixed with something metallic. It didn't come from my fire. This was different, carried by the wind from somewhere deeper in the forest. The smell got stronger the longer I sat there, until it was sharp in the air. I got up and looked toward where it seemed to be coming from, but all I saw were the dark outlines of trees. I didn't sleep that night. The smell lingered for hours, and I sat awake until the first light of morning touched the forest. When I finally got up, I decided to follow the direction of the smell from last night. Maybe there was another old campsite, or maybe something had burned recently. I followed a narrow animal trail that led uphill. It didn't take long before I found it. An old fire pit, blackened and filled with half-burned wood, sat in a small clearing. Around it were pieces of trash. An old can, a ripped backpack, and a broken knife blade. The ground was disturbed as if someone had been there not long ago. I felt that same heavy feeling in my stomach as before. It wasn't that these things were dangerous on their own. It was that they didn't belong there anymore. I turned back toward camp, but something caught my eye. Near the base of a tree was a torn piece of fabric, dark blue, maybe from a jacket. It looked fresh, not faded like the rest of the things I'd seen. I didn't pick it up. I just looked at it, then turned and walked faster. My pace turned into a near jog by the time I saw my tent again. That day, the forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, but there was never anyone there. The wind barely moved. Even the creek seemed quieter. When night came again, I made the decision to leave in the morning. I'd had enough. It wasn't worth another night out there. I packed most of my things early, leaving only my tent and sleeping bag for the night. I stayed awake again, sitting near the fire, staring into the darkness. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, moving through the trees. This time I saw movement. A shape, faint, tall, moved between the trunks about 50 feet away. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person. My flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. The figure moved closer, then stopped. My whole body felt like it was frozen in place. After a long pause, it turned and disappeared into the dark. I didn't wait for the sun. I grabbed what I could and left. My hands were shaking as I took down the tent, and I didn't even bother rolling it up properly. I just stuffed it into my pack and started walking. The woods were still dark, and every sound made me walk faster. I didn't stop until I saw my car through the trees. When I finally got there, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The driver's side door was open. I was sure I had locked it. My backpack was on the ground, unzipped. Nothing seemed stolen, but it had definitely been opened. I threw my gear inside, got in the car, and drove without looking back. Even after getting home, I couldn't shake the unease. For days, I kept thinking about those footprints, the smell, the figure in the woods, and the open car door. It felt too deliberate, too personal, like whoever it was had been watching me the entire time. I never went back to that area. I still camp, but I stick to known trails now, places where I can see other people nearby. I learned something during that trip. It's not the wildlife or the dark that you should fear when you're alone in the woods. It's realizing that maybe you weren't as alone as you thought. I had been planning that camping trip for months. I wanted to be completely alone. No phone, no noise, no distractions, just me and the quiet of nature. I chose a random spot deep in the woods, somewhere I found on an old hiking forum that hadn't been updated in years. The directions were rough, just a few coordinates and a line saying it was near a dried-up creek bed. It sounded perfect for what I wanted. No tourists, no campers, just isolation. It was early summer when I finally packed everything. My backpack was heavier than usual. A tent, sleeping bag, small gas stove, 2 days worth of food, a flashlight, knife, and a first aid kit. I left before sunrise, driving 3 hours north before the road turned into gravel and then into dirt. My phone signal disappeared somewhere along the way and I didn't mind it. I parked near a small clearing, locked the car, and started hiking. The trail wasn't really a trail, just a faint path that looked like it had been used years ago. Fallen branches crossed it, tall grass brushed against my knees, and every step made the dry leaves crunch under my boots. I liked that feeling, being so far from anything that even the sound of my footsteps felt strange. It took me about 2 hours to reach the spot. The area was flat enough to set up my tent and open enough to get some sunlight. A few feet away there was what looked like a small ditch running along the trees, probably the old creek bed mentioned in the post. I dropped my bag, stretched, and started setting up camp. The silence there was deep. No cars, no voices, not even the faint hum of power lines, only the wind moving slowly through the trees. It almost made me uncomfortable how still everything felt. After I finished setting up, I sat on a fallen log and just looked around. The forest looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. By late afternoon, I boiled some water, made instant noodles, and ate while watching the sunlight fade between the trees. It felt peaceful in a strange way, like time had stopped. But after the sun went down, the stillness began to feel heavier. Every sound, even a small one, echoed in my head. I could hear branches snapping far off, but the pattern was strange, too slow and irregular to be just the wind. I told myself it was animals. That made sense. The forest was full of them. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that the noises were closer than they should have been. Around midnight, I finally got into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. The air was cool, and the smell of pine and dirt filled the space around me. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the usual small rustle that a squirrel or raccoon makes. It was heavier. I froze listening. The steps were slow and careful, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest. I stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then I heard something faint, like breathing. Not an animal's breathing, though. This was rhythmic, human-like, and uncomfortably close to the tent. I could almost sense the weight of it standing just a few feet away. I wanted to grab my knife, but the slightest movement would have made a noise. I waited, holding my breath. After what felt like minutes, the sound faded and the footsteps moved away into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring into the dark, counting every second until morning. When daylight finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Everything looked normal, except for the fact that the ground near my tent had fresh footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there before, and the shape was too big and deep to be from any animal I knew. The prints circled the tent once and then disappeared toward the trees. I felt a cold chill run through me, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was a hunter or some hiker who'd gotten lost. Still, something about the careful placement of the steps didn't feel right. I decided to stay alert but didn't want to leave yet. I'd planned this trip for months and I didn't want to run back just because I got spooked. The second day passed quietly, but the uneasiness never left me. Every time I heard a sound, I turned my head too quickly. The silence felt sharper than before, like the forest was listening back. When the sun started to set again, I noticed something strange. My camp gear had shifted slightly. My bag was leaning against a different side of the log, and the zipper on it was half open. I was sure I hadn't left it like that. I always double-check my things. That's when I noticed something else. A faint mark on one of my tent's support poles, like a scrape from a knife. It wasn't deep, but it was fresh. That night I didn't even try to sleep. I sat inside the tent with my flashlight off, knife in hand, and listened. The forest around me was alive with quiet noises, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant crack of branches. But around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving in a wide circle around my camp. It happened for hours. The steps would come closer, stop, then start again somewhere else. Once I thought I heard breathing again, even closer than before. I stayed silent, terrified to even move. Around 3 a.m, everything went still again, and I finally dared to turn on the flashlight. Nothing. Just trees, and the reflection of light bouncing off wet leaves. But I knew someone had been out there. By morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my bag without caring about the order. I just wanted to get out. But before I left, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The footprints were back. This time, they weren't just around the tent. They led from the ditch near the trees right up to where I'd been sleeping. It hit me that whoever was out there hadn't just been watching, they'd been getting closer every night. Started hiking back the way I came, but I quickly realized I couldn't find the exact path. Everything looked the same, trees, rocks, fallen branches. My compass needle was working, but the terrain didn't match what I remembered. I kept walking, hoping I'd eventually find the clearing where I parked the car. Hours passed. The sun was high and my legs felt heavy. My water was half gone. That's when I saw something strange in the distance. A pile of branches stacked together like a makeshift shelter. I approached it slowly. It looked freshly built, with sticks pressed together in a cone shape. Inside, I saw empty food wrappers and what looked like torn fabric, maybe from a sleeping bag. Whoever had been near my tent had been camping out here too, but not in any normal way. There were bones scattered near the base, small ones probably from animals, but they were picked clean and arranged in odd little circles. I felt sick looking at it. The smell was sharp, like rotting meat. I backed away slowly, trying not to step on anything loud. That's when I noticed something else, my own footprints leading to that place. I must have walked right past it on my way in and never noticed. Panic started to build. I turned back in the direction I thought my car was, walking faster and faster. Every sound behind me felt like it was following. I didn't look back, just kept moving. By late afternoon, my legs were trembling from exhaustion. Then I saw something that nearly made me collapse, my own campsite again. Somehow, after all that walking, I'd looped back to the same place. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. The flattened grass where my tent had been, the ashes of my small fire, even the footprints. But there was something new. A set of footprints leading right up to where I'd been sitting before, stopping inches from where my chair had been. That was enough. I dropped my bag and ran. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I stopped only when I saw the faint outline of the road through the trees. My car was still there, dusty but untouched. I threw my things into the back seat, started the engine, and didn't look back. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles away. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror inside the restroom, I looked like I hadn't slept in days. Pale face, eyes wide, covered in dirt. Even now, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. But I know they were human. The breathing, the footprints, the careful movements, they weren't wild animal instincts. They were deliberate. Sometimes when I camp now, I still think about that place. The creek bed, the stacked branches, the circles of bones. I imagine someone still living out there, moving through the trees, watching anyone who gets too close. I never went back, and I never will. That spot isn't just a random patch of woods. It's a place where someone lives in silence, waiting for people like me who think they're alone. I've been camping alone for years. I always found peace in the silence of the woods, the kind that feels like time has stopped and nothing beyond those trees matters. But this one trip changed that feeling completely. Since that weekend, I haven't been able to spend a night outdoors without feeling like something's watching me. What happened wasn't supernatural, but it was something far worse. Something real. It started in mid-June last year. I had taken a few days off from work to clear my head. I didn't tell many people where I was going because I preferred being completely alone. I just told my younger brother that I'd be gone for a few days and that I'd text him when I got back. I packed my usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, gas stove, knife, flashlight, food, and my small hiking camera. My plan was to camp near a small river that ran behind an old ridge about 2 hours from the main highway. That ridge was part of a trail system I'd explored before, but I had never gone beyond it. The last time I was there, I noticed a narrow path that led down a steep drop, almost hidden behind overgrown brush. It wasn't marked on any of the trail maps, and that's what caught my attention. I decided this trip I'd go down that path and find out where it led. I wanted total isolation, and that spot seemed perfect for that. The drive took me about 4 hours. The first 2 were smooth highway miles, but once I got onto the forest road, it turned into gravel and dirt. It was rough, bumpy, and full of tight turns, but that was exactly what I wanted. Somewhere no one else would bother going. I parked near a faded wooden sign that had long lost any words it once had. From there, I loaded my backpack, locked the car, and started walking. The air felt thick, almost heavy with humidity. The trees on that trail were tall and close together, blocking most of the sunlight. The path had probably been forgotten for decades. My boots crunched over old branches and dead leaves as I climbed toward the ridge. It was a steep climb, but when I finally reached the top, I could see miles of forest stretching in every direction. Beyond that ridge was nothing but wilderness. That's where I spotted that small hidden path again. It was narrow, uneven, and dropped sharply down the other side. The soil was loose and muddy, so I had to move slowly to avoid slipping. I could tell by the way the grass was pressed down that someone or something had used this path recently. Maybe a deer, maybe another hiker. I didn't think much of it at the time. Once I reached the bottom, I found a small clearing beside a narrow river. It was quiet there, eerily quiet. The kind of silence where even the wind seems to hold its breath. I could hear only the soft rush of water and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deep in the trees. The ground was flat and covered in moss, perfect for setting up my tent. I dropped my backpack, stretched my shoulders, and began unpacking my gear. By late afternoon, my camp was ready. Tent pitched near the river, a small fire pit surrounded by rocks, and a line tied between 2 trees for drying clothes. I sat beside the water for a while, washing my hands and face. The water was cold, so cold it made my fingers ache. The river wasn't deep, but it was clear. I could see fish darting beneath the surface. When the sun started sinking behind the ridge, I made myself a simple dinner, instant noodles and coffee from a small camping stove. I sat on a log and watched the light fade through the trees. The forest darkened faster than I expected. Within minutes, everything turned a deep gray, then black. I switched on my flashlight and checked the perimeter one last time before crawling into my tent. The first night was calm. I could hear the river, the rustle of leaves, the soft chirping of crickets. It didn't take long before I fell asleep. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was one of those moments where your eyes open suddenly, and you don't know why. I lay still, listening. The forest was completely silent now. No crickets, no wind, no movement, just silence. That kind of quiet always puts me on edge. Then I heard something faint, maybe 30 feet away. A slow crunching sound, like someone stepping on dry leaves. It came once, then again, then stopped. I froze. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't move. I strained my ears, trying to make out anything else. The sound came again, 2 more steps, slower this time. Then nothing. My pulse was pounding. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer. Maybe a raccoon. I waited another 10 minutes before the sound disappeared completely. I stayed awake for almost an hour after that before I finally drifted back to sleep. In the morning, the sun was already high. I got out of the tent and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed, but when I checked near the edge of the clearing, I found something odd. There were footprints in the mud near the riverbank. Human footprints, barefoot. The toes and arches were clear, pressed deep into the soft soil. They looked fresh, too fresh. I crouched and studied them for a while. The stride looked uneven, almost limping. Whoever it was had been walking along the river toward the east. My first thought was that someone else was camping nearby, but I hadn't seen any signs of another person the whole time. Still, I didn't want to assume the worst. I shook it off and decided to take a short hike eastward along the river to see if there were any other campsites or trails. After walking about a mile, I found no signs of anyone. The forest only got denser and darker. I turned back uneasy. When I returned to camp, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The small pile of firewood I'd stacked last night was scattered. The stones around the fire pit were shifted like someone had kicked them. Nothing was stolen, but it was clear that someone or something had been in my camp. That's when I realized how isolated I really was. My phone had no signal. The ridge behind me blocked any chance of reception. If something went wrong, there was no quick way out. I decided to stay alert that night and see if anything happened again. I collected more firewood, built a stronger fire, and kept my flashlight close. As darkness fell, the forest once again sank into silence. The flames flickered against the trees, making shadows dance across the clearing. I ate a quick dinner and sat watching the fire until my eyelids grew heavy. I eventually crawled into the tent but kept the flashlight in my hand. It must have been around midnight when I woke again. This time it wasn't just a faint sound, it was clear. Footsteps. Slow, steady, and close. My heart started racing immediately. I held my breath and listened. The steps circled the tent. 1, 2, 3, and then they stopped. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Whoever it was, they were standing just outside. I didn't move. I wanted to peek through the zipper, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. After what felt like a full minute, I heard the faint shuffle of movement again. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until they were gone completely. When dawn broke, I rushed outside. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Fresh footprints, barefoot again. They were clearer now. Long, narrow feet. Same limp stride. But this time I noticed something else. Tiny specks of blood mixed in with the mud. My chest tightened as I stared at them. The prints led from the edge of the clearing back into the trees. I didn't pack up right away. A part of me wanted to believe I was overreacting, but the logical side of me knew better. I decided I'd leave by noon. Before that, I wanted to check one thing. I followed the direction the footprints led just a short distance into the woods. After about 50 feet, I found what looked like a small makeshift shelter built from branches and moss. It wasn't much, just a crude lean-to against a fallen tree. Inside it were scraps of old fabric, an empty can, and a piece of rope. No sleeping bag, no tent, just filth. Whoever had been here wasn't camping, they were living out here. That realization made me sick. I quickly returned to my camp and started packing. But when I got back, I noticed my backpack had been opened. The zipper was halfway down and some of my food was missing, specifically one of my sealed cans and a protein bar. The thief hadn't taken anything else, just food. I packed as fast as I could. By noon, I was ready to leave. But as I turned toward the path that led up the ridge, something made me stop. There was movement at the far end of the clearing. I saw a figure standing between the trees, half hidden by the shadows. They were tall and thin, wearing torn, dirty clothes that hung loosely on their body. Their hair was matted and long. From the distance, I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could tell they were staring directly at me, not moving. Just standing there, I froze. My first instinct was to shout, but no words came out. My legs felt heavy. The figure didn't move, not even a twitch. I slowly backed away toward the trail, keeping my eyes locked on them. When I finally turned to start climbing, I risked one last glance back, and they were gone. The clearing was empty again. I climbed that ridge faster than I ever had before. The path was steep and slippery, but adrenaline pushed me forward. When I finally reached the top, I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and look back. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the distance. The hike back to my car took longer than I remembered. Every sound made me jump, the crack of a... It was early September when I decided to take a solo camping trip. The idea had been sitting in my head for months. I had been working nonstop, sleeping late, waking up tired, and spending almost every hour behind a screen. I needed to be away from people for a while. I needed to breathe clean air, hear nothing but wind, birds, and maybe the soft crackle of a fire. So I packed my tent, some food, a few bottles of water, a small stove, and set out for the woods near a lake I had read about online. It wasn't a tourist spot, just a quiet place where locals sometimes fished or hiked. That's what drew me to it, the idea of being completely alone. The drive was about 4 hours long. The last hour was rough, with the road turning into uneven gravel. My car shook over every rock and dip, but I didn't mind. The woods on both sides of the road were thick, dark green, and endless. Every now and then I'd see the sunlight slice through the branches, hitting the road in small patches. The air felt heavier there, colder. I rolled down my window and the smell of pine filled the car. It was the kind of smell that reminded me of my childhood, those rare times my father used to take me hiking. I felt calm for the first time in weeks. By the time I reached the lake, it was late afternoon. The water looked still, almost glassy, and the trees reflected perfectly on its surface. There wasn't a single soul around. No parked cars, no tents, no voices, just silence. I parked near a clearing and got out. The air was cooler than I expected, and there was a faint sound of water lapping against the shore. I picked a spot about 20 meters from the water and started setting up my tent. The ground was dry, but the soil was soft, so the tent stakes went in easily. I spread out my sleeping bag, laid out my gear, and started a small fire before the sun began to set. When night came, the forest around me grew darker than I could have imagined. The moon was just a thin curve in the sky. I sat near the fire, heating a can of soup and listening to the crackling of burning wood. Every so often I heard small movements in the forest, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I brushed it off as animals. It's a forest, after all. It wasn't silence that bothered me. It was how thick the quiet felt when nothing moved, like even the air was watching me. I tried to sleep early that night, but the forest was alive in its own way. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and I could hear something moving near the lake every now and then. I told myself it was just a deer coming for a drink. But a few hours later I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure what woke me. Maybe a sound. Maybe just the feeling that something wasn't right. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and my tent was lit only by the dim orange light of the coals. I lay still, listening. The woods were silent again, too silent. Then I heard a sound. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, coming from near the water. I froze. The sound was faint but deliberate. It wasn't an animal moving through bushes. It was heavier, human-like. I stayed still for several minutes until it faded away. I tried to convince myself it was just the echo of my imagination. Eventually I fell asleep again, though lightly. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight filtering through the fabric of the tent. The forest looked peaceful again, like the night before had just been a dream. I stepped out, stretched, and went down to the water to wash my face. That's when I noticed footprints on the edge of the lake. They weren't mine. The prints were fresh, leading into the trees and disappearing where the ground hardened. My first thought was that maybe someone had come to fish early in the morning. But I hadn't heard any boats and there were no tire tracks near my car. Still, I shrugged it off. It was public land after all. Anyone could be out here. I spent most of that day hiking around the area. The woods were thick but beautiful. The trees were tall. The air smelled of moss and earth, and the sunlight kept breaking through in spots, lighting up the forest floor. I followed a narrow trail for a couple of miles until it reached a small ridge that overlooked the lake. From up there, I could see my campsite clearly, a small patch of color between the trees. I sat there for a while eating a sandwich and watched how still everything was. No sounds, no signs of people. It was peaceful. I started heading back in the late afternoon, taking my time to explore small clearings and listening to the wind move through the trees. When I got back to camp, something felt slightly off. My backpack, which I'd left leaning against a log, had been moved. Not far, maybe just a few feet, but I was sure I hadn't touched it that morning. I checked inside, everything was still there. Food, flashlight, first aid kit, nothing missing. Still, the thought of someone walking into my camp while I was gone didn't sit right. I checked the ground around the tent and noticed faint footprints again, half smudged in the soil. That made my stomach tighten. I didn't want to overthink it, but my brain wouldn't let it go. Someone had been here. I decided to stay closer to the tent that evening. I kept the fire going longer, making sure it stayed bright and warm. I tried to read a book I'd brought, but my eyes kept drifting toward the tree line. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move, just a flicker of motion between the trunks, but every time I stared, it was gone. The woods were growing darker by the minute, and the quietness was beginning to feel heavy again. I told myself it was just paranoia, that being alone in the woods was making my mind play tricks on me. When I finally went inside my tent, I left the flashlight beside me and kept the zipper halfway open, so I could peek out toward the fire. The flames flickered low but steady. I lay there for a while listening. The forest had its usual noises again, but after an hour or so I heard that same sound as the night before. Footsteps. This time they were closer. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the water again. My heart started racing. I didn't move, just listened. The sound stopped suddenly, right where the light from the fire ended. I couldn't see anything clearly, but I felt it. Someone was there watching. I wanted to believe it was my imagination. But then I heard the faint sound of something brushing against my car. A metallic click, like someone testing the handle. That sound broke me out of my stillness. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the car. Nothing. The light reflected off the metal, but I couldn't see anyone. My fire flickered from the sudden movement of air as I stepped out. I scanned around again, nothing but shadows. But the footprints were there the next morning, fresh, clear, leading around the car and disappearing back into the woods. That day, I couldn't relax. I didn't hike. I didn't even go near the water. I just sat at camp feeling exposed, waiting for something to happen. Every time a branch snapped or a bird flew up suddenly, I felt my pulse jump. Around noon, I decided I had to check around just to be sure I wasn't losing my mind. I walked a few hundred meters into the woods behind my tent, following the direction of the prints. The deeper I went, the colder it got, the light dimmer under the dense trees. Then I saw it. A small clearing with what looked like old burnt wood and bits of fabric scattered around. It looked like an old camp, abandoned for years, but someone had been there recently. There were fresh footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. I turned back fast, uneasy now. I packed most of my stuff when I got back to camp, ready to leave if anything felt off again. I stayed one more night only because it was too late to drive back through the narrow forest road in the dark. That night I barely slept. The noises started again around midnight. The same slow steps, the same eerie quiet when they stopped. I didn't get out of my tent. I just sat there in the dark, gripping my flashlight and knife, listening to the soft crunch of footsteps moving around the camp. Then silence. For a long time, nothing. I think I must have stayed awake until sunrise without realizing it. When I finally got out, I saw clear signs of someone having been there again. My fire pit had been moved slightly, as if someone had nudged the stones. There were boot prints, fresh, leading straight toward the tent and then away into the woods. I didn't waste time. I threw everything into the car and drove off, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the main road 2 hours later. That night, when I finally got home, I checked everything in my gear. Nothing was missing. But when I unpacked my backpack, I found something that froze me. Inside one of the side pockets, a pocket I hadn't opened once during the trip, was a small folded piece of fabric. Old, dirty, torn. I didn't recognize it. It smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood, like it had been out there for years. I don't know who left it or when. Maybe it meant nothing, but the idea that someone had been close enough to touch my things while I slept, that thought stayed with me. It's been months since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone again. Sometimes I think about going back to that lake just to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But then I remember the sound of those footsteps circling my tent, the stillness of the woods, and that piece of fabric in my bag. Some things don't need explaining. Sometimes just knowing you were being watched is enough to keep you out of the woods forever. I decided to go camping alone that weekend because I needed to clear my head. I'd been working long hours, barely sleeping, and felt like I was drowning in my own routine. I wanted silence, fresh air, and distance from everything familiar. I picked a random spot on the map, a remote forested area near an old logging road in northern Vermont. It wasn't a marked campground, just a patch of woods that seemed untouched. I figured I'd park near the trail, hike in a few miles, and set up camp by a stream I saw on the map. I left early that morning. The sky was gray and heavy, but the air felt cool and clean. The road leading there was narrow and cracked, winding deeper into the hills. The further I drove, the quieter everything became. My phone lost signal about an hour before I reached the spot. The forest on both sides grew thicker, the trees taller, their branches knitting together above me. I parked my car where the dirt road ended, packed up my backpack, tent, and some food, and started walking into the woods. The trail wasn't really a trail, just a faint path between the trees that probably used to be part of the old logging route. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and I could smell damp earth and pine. Birds called now and then, and somewhere far off I could hear running water. I walked for almost 2 hours, not rushing, just trying to find a good place to camp. I finally found a clearing next to a shallow stream, wide enough for my tent and a small fire pit. The ground was even, covered in pine needles. It looked like a perfect spot, quiet, hidden, peaceful. I unpacked, set up the tent, and gathered some wood. The air was cooler near the water, and I could hear the slow, steady sound of the stream trickling over rocks. After setting up camp, I walked around to get familiar with the area. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions. I noticed some old tree stumps, probably from when this place was logged decades ago. There were faint tire ruts half covered by moss and leaves, like someone had once driven equipment through here. A few crows moved between the trees, their wings loud in the silence. I saw no signs of people, no wrappers, no footprints, nothing. By evening I had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove and ate, while watching the light fade through the trees. The forest grew darker fast, and by the time I finished eating it was almost completely black except for the orange glow of my fire. The stream's sound blended with the quiet rustling of the woods. I sat there a while thinking about nothing, just breathing. When I finally crawled into my tent, it was around 10 p.m. The forest was completely silent now. I could hear only the faint hiss of the stream and a few insects buzzing outside the tent. I laid in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon roof above me, letting the tiredness wash over me. Sometime later, I woke up suddenly. It was still dark and I couldn't tell what time it was. For a few seconds, I just lay there listening. I didn't know what had woken me. There was no sound outside, no wind, no rain, just silence. My first thought was maybe a branch had fallen nearby or an animal had moved past the tent. I stayed still, my heart beating faster. After a minute or two, I heard something faint, a soft crunching sound like footsteps on dry leaves. It wasn't close but not far either. The steps were slow, irregular, like someone walking carefully. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came from the direction of the stream. I told myself it was probably a deer or raccoon, but something about the rhythm felt wrong. Too slow, too heavy. It stopped for a few seconds, then started again. I could hear the leaves shifting, twigs snapping lightly. I waited for it to fade away, but it didn't. Eventually, the sound stopped completely. I waited for a long time, barely moving. When nothing else happened, I convinced myself it was an animal and tried to go back to sleep. It took a long time before I finally drifted off again. When I woke up, the sun was already high. The forest looked calm and normal again, like nothing strange had happened. I got up, stretched, and went to check near the stream. I didn't see any tracks, at least none I could identify clearly. The soft ground near the water had some disturbed spots, but that could have been anything. I spent most of the day exploring the area, walking deeper into the woods. I found an old metal oil drum half buried in dirt and a few pieces of rusted machinery. Leftovers from the logging days, I assumed. I took some photos, gathered more wood, and returned to camp. The whole place had an odd feeling, though, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off. By evening, I had another fire going. I sat beside it, eating, listening to the forest settling for the night. The same quiet descended again. When I turned off my lantern, the darkness felt thicker than before. I could barely see the outlines of the trees against the night sky. I lay in my tent again, and it didn't take long before I started hearing things. Not loud, just small sounds. Branches moving, faint crunching, something brushing against the ground. I tried to ignore it, but my mind was alert, picking up every small noise. Then sometime after midnight, I heard it again, footsteps. This time slower, closer. I froze. My breathing got shallow. The sound came from the direction of the trees behind my tent. It was steady, like someone walking in circles, stopping, then moving again. I could hear the shift of leaves, the dull thud of soft soil under weight. My body was rigid. I didn't dare move. After a long moment, I heard the sound of something metallic hitting a rock. A sharp, quick noise that echoed faintly through the woods. My heart raced. I didn't have anything metal outside the tent except the small cooking pot near the fire pit. The sound came again, softer this time, like it was being moved. I felt a cold wave of fear crawl through me. I stayed inside the tent for almost an hour, listening. Eventually, the noises stopped completely. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for daylight. When the sun came up, I got out and looked around. The fire pit was cold. My cooking pot was gone. I searched the area but didn't find it anywhere. I even checked near the stream and up the trail. It was just gone. I felt uneasy but tried to stay logical. Maybe an animal dragged it off. But it didn't sit right with me. I decided I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. I tried to keep busy through the day, exploring a bit, fishing in the stream, keeping the fire going. The forest stayed quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I'd catch glimpses of movement through the trees just at the edge of my vision, but when I looked, there was nothing. As night came again, I built my fire bigger than before. I sat closer to it, watching the light flicker on the trees. The silence was heavy, like the forest itself was waiting. I didn't go into the tent for a long time. When I finally did, I kept my flashlight in my hand and the knife I'd brought beside me. I must have fallen asleep because I woke again to a sound, faint but clear. This time it was the sound of something being dragged. It wasn't far away. It was slow, gritty, like something rough sliding over dirt. My stomach turned cold. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The dragging sound came closer, stopping and starting. Then there was a thud, one soft but heavy, followed by silence. I could hear my own breathing. I stayed perfectly still for what felt like forever. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I must have drifted into a shallow, restless sleep. When I woke, it was still early. The air was cold and a thin fog clung to the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. That's when I saw it. Near the stream, just a few yards away, there was a large wet patch of dirt darker than the ground around it. Something had been dragged there. The grass was bent and flattened, leading away from the clearing deep into the woods. I followed it slowly, every step tight in my chest. The trail went about 20 yards before stopping near a cluster of thick trees. There, lying half buried in mud, was my missing cooking pot, dented and covered in dirt. Next to it was a shredded piece of blue fabric that didn't belong to me. It looked like part of a jacket, old and torn. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. I didn't want to find out more. I packed my things as fast as I could, stuffed everything into my backpack, and put out the fire. The forest felt different now, not just quiet but tense, like it was holding its breath. I hiked back toward the car without stopping. Every sound made me turn. A few times I thought I heard faint movement behind me. Branches shifting, leaves crunching. But I didn't look back. I just kept walking. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and started the engine. As I drove away, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure, far down the road, standing between the trees. It was too far to make out details, just a shape, still and dark against the pale morning light. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town hours later. I sat in the car, hands shaking, trying to understand what had happened. I thought about the sounds, the missing pot, the dragging, the fabric. I didn't know who or what had been out there with me, but it wasn't an animal. Someone else had been in those woods. I've camped plenty of times since then, but never alone, and never without checking where I'm going first. That place still sits on the map, unmarked, silent. I don't know if anyone else ever camps there or if they've seen or heard what I did. But sometimes late at night I think about the sound of those footsteps. Slow, heavy, careful. And I realize they weren't wandering aimlessly. They were circling me. I had been planning that camping trip for months. I wanted to be alone for a while, away from work, noise, and people. I picked a spot deep in the woods near a lake that I found through an old hiking forum. It wasn't a popular location, which made it perfect for solitude. The area had no cell service, no nearby cabins, and the closest town was over 30 kilometers away. I packed carefully a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 5 days, a knife, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I wanted peace, and I thought the silence of nature would be the best thing for my head. The first day went well. The drive to the area took most of the morning, and by afternoon I had parked near a dirt trail that led deeper into the forest. The air was damp and cool, the kind that smells like pine needles and wet soil. I walked for about an hour before I found the lake. It wasn't big, maybe a few hundred meters across, but it looked beautiful. The water was dark and still, and the trees around it leaned slightly over the edges, their reflections rippling with the occasional breeze. I set up my tent near a cluster of birch trees, not too close to the water, but close enough to hear the soft lapping of waves during the night. After setting everything up, I started a small fire, made dinner, and sat watching the sky turn orange and purple. The forest around me came alive with sound, crickets, frogs, and the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. It didn't feel threatening. It felt like nature was settling into its rhythm. When night came, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I woke up early. Mist hung low over the lake, and the air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I boiled some coffee on my portable stove and decided to hike around the area. I took a small backpack with a bottle of water and a few snacks. The woods were thick but peaceful. I walked through patches of moss and damp leaves, stepping over fallen logs and hearing the crunch of twigs beneath my boots. After about an hour of walking, I noticed faint signs of a trail that seemed old. The ground was uneven, and there were signs of once-cut logs now covered in moss. It looked like maybe someone had used this area long ago. Curious, I followed it for a while until it led to a small clearing. There were old pieces of wood, maybe from a collapsed cabin or shed. I couldn't tell, but it looked like someone had once built something there. I didn't think much of it and decided to head back before losing my sense of direction. When I reached my camp again, the fire pit still had a bit of smoke from the previous night. Everything looked as I had left it. Later that day, I spent time fishing by the lake, though I didn't catch anything. The sun set early behind the trees, and I sat near my fire again, listening to the sounds of the forest. It felt peaceful, until I noticed something that made me uneasy. Across the lake, maybe 50 meters away, I saw movement. It was faint, just a shadow between the trees. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer, but the shape was tall. I stared for a long time, but whatever it was didn't move again. I tried to shake it off. Forests play tricks on your eyes, especially as light fades. Still, I kept glancing back at that spot every few minutes. When night finally came, I put out the fire and went into my tent. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual insect and frog sounds had faded. I lay still, listening. Somewhere in the distance, I heard something crack. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like a branch snapping under weight. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe the wind. Then another sound came, this time closer, another faint crunch of something stepping on leaves. I held my breath and waited. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and eventually I fell asleep again. The next morning, I checked around the tent. I expected to see maybe animal tracks or disturbed soil, but there was nothing unusual. The ground was soft from recent rain, so if anything had been walking around, I should have seen some kind of print. But there was nothing. The day went by slowly. I spent most of it reading and resting by the lake, but that uneasy feeling from the night before stuck with me. I kept glancing across the lake, half expecting to see something again. The silence that evening felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. That night I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. I could hear faint wind outside, the soft flapping of my tent walls, but something else too. A low, steady sound like someone slowly dragging their foot through the dirt. It wasn't constant. It would stop, then start again. My flashlight was next to me, so I turned it on and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. The sound had stopped. I stayed still for a long time, just listening. My heart was pounding. I finally zipped the tent back up, telling myself I was overreacting. But it took a long time before I fell asleep again. In the morning, I walked around again, checking for tracks. I found something odd near the tree line behind my tent. The leaves there looked disturbed, and there were faint marks in the soil. Not footprints, but small indentations like someone had pressed a stick or pole into the ground repeatedly. I crouched down to look closer, but I couldn't make sense of it. That afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I kept my food sealed in a bag, tied high between two trees to keep animals away. It was something I'd done for years while camping. But when I went to check it, the bag was untied and on the ground. Some of the food was gone, some torn open. The knot I had used wasn't broken or chewed. It was untied, cleanly and carefully. It didn't make sense. No animal would have done that. I felt cold all over. I started scanning the forest, but everything looked still. My mind began to race. Maybe another person was out here, a hunter, a drifter, someone passing through. But why would they touch my food and then disappear? I spent the rest of the day feeling watched. Every time I looked into the trees, I expected to see movement. I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone anymore. I decided to pack up the next morning and leave early. That night was the worst. I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard something again, footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. Not rushing or running, just walking. I turned off my flashlight and froze. The steps got closer, stopping somewhere behind my tent. I could hear the faint crunch of leaves under weight, then silence. I waited, barely breathing. Then came a sound that still chills me when I think about it. A slow scraping sound like metal brushing against fabric. It was faint but close, too close. I didn't move. I just lay there, clutching my knife, trying to stay silent. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. Then slowly the footsteps began to fade away into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until the first bit of light started to show and packed my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the entire time. The forest was dead quiet again. Even the birds were silent. When I got to the dirt trail where I had parked, I turned to take one last look. That's when I saw it. On the edge of the trees, near where my camp had been, something was standing. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but it looked like a person. Tall, thin, still. I blinked, and it stepped back into the shadows without making a sound. I drove off without looking back. When I reached the nearest gas station miles away, I got out of the car and checked everything again, my gear, my food, my pack. That's when I noticed something strange in the bag where I kept my knife and lighter. A small object had been placed inside, a single pine cone wrapped tightly in a strip of cloth that looked torn from my own. And that was the moment it hit me. Whoever had been near my camp wasn't just wandering through the woods. They had been watching me, waiting. They had come close enough to touch my things, to take food, and to leave something behind. I still don't know who it was or why they did it. But I haven't gone camping alone since. Whenever I think about that trip, I realize how silent the forest truly was. Not because it was empty, but because something out there was waiting for me to let my guard down. And it nearly did. I went camping alone last summer, deep in a forested area of Montana where hardly anyone goes. I had been driving for hours on a narrow, winding road that cut through thick woods. The trees were tall and close together, their branches overlapping to form a dark canopy that let in only bits of light. I had wanted to find a quiet place away from crowds, away from noise, just to be surrounded by nature for a few days. I had done solo camping before, but never this deep into the wilderness. When I finally reached a small clearing near a stream, I decided to set up camp there. The ground was slightly uneven, covered with pine needles and small rocks, but it was good enough. The air smelled fresh and earthy, the kind of smell that makes you feel isolated but calm at the same time. The sound of the running water nearby gave a steady background noise that drowned out the silence. I parked my truck just off the trail, unloaded my gear, and began setting up my tent. It took me about an hour to get everything ready. I pitched the tent, gathered firewood, and made a small ring of stones for the fire. The sun had started dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the whole area look darker than it should have been. I cooked a simple meal, some beans and rice I had brought along, and ate it sitting on a log by the fire. The forest felt calm, quiet, and endless. That first night I slept surprisingly well. The air was cold but dry, and the faint sound of the stream beside me made it easier to rest. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the faint noise of something walking through the woods. The crunching of dry leaves was slow and heavy, not like a deer's quick, light steps. It stopped for a while, then started again, closer this time. I sat up inside my tent, holding my breath. My heart started pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The steps continued for about a minute before fading away. I waited, frozen in place, for what felt like forever. Eventually, everything went quiet again except for the water in the stream. I convinced myself it was probably just a bear or a moose passing by, and forced myself to lie down. Sleep didn't come easily after that, but I eventually drifted off. The next morning, I went to check around my camp. There were marks on the ground near the tree line, deep footprints that looked like they belonged to a man, not an animal. They were larger than my own, spaced far apart like whoever made them had a long stride. They led from the trees toward my tent, then stopped just a few feet away before turning back into the forest. That sight sent a chill down my spine. Someone had walked right up to my tent in the night and stood there. I didn't want to believe that. I told myself it could have been my imagination, or that the prints were old and just looked fresh because of the morning dew. But the dirt looked disturbed, and some pine needles were crushed recently. The thought of someone watching me in my sleep was deeply unsettling. Still, I had driven too far and set up too much to just leave. I decided to stay at least another night. I spent that day exploring the area. I followed the stream downstream for almost an hour, until it led into a wider part of the forest where the trees opened up a bit. There were signs of old logging work, rotting stumps, cut trunks, and what looked like the remains of a small cabin that had collapsed years ago. It was just a few wooden planks and a rusted metal stove half buried in the dirt. The air there felt heavier, like the forest didn't want me staying too long. I went back to camp before sunset and lit a bigger fire than the night before. I sat close to it, reading a bit, eating snacks, trying to push the unease away. The night was colder than before, and the wind made the trees creak. Around midnight, I heard it again, the slow, careful crunch of footsteps in the distance. I turned off my lantern and sat completely still. The steps grew louder, moving toward my tent again, stopping, then starting again, closer each time. My hands were shaking as I reached for the hunting knife I always kept beside my sleeping bag. The sound stopped just outside the tent. I could hear breathing now, slow, controlled, like someone was trying not to make noise. Then I heard something brushing against the side of the tent, faint but deliberate. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife, not daring to move. After a few long seconds, the breathing stopped. I listened, waiting for any sound, but there was nothing. Then suddenly, I heard the sound of someone running away through the woods. It was fast, loud, and went on for several seconds before fading completely. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I just sat there, knife in hand, staring at the tent wall, waiting for daylight. In the morning, I checked again. The footprints were back, fresh ones this time, clearer and closer. They stopped right at the edge of the tent again. The person had been standing right outside. My stomach turned when I noticed something else. A small piece of paper folded neatly and placed under a rock near my fire pit. I picked it up and opened it. There was no writing, just a small drawing. 2 rough circles that looked like eyes and a line beneath them like a smile. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed my gear as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. I threw everything into the truck and started driving out. The narrow dirt road looked different in daylight, but I could still feel eyes on me as I left. Every few minutes I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking out from the trees. After about 20 minutes of driving, I came across an old wooden sign I hadn't noticed before on the way in. It was partly covered in moss, but I could make out the faded letters. Private land, no trespassing. That explained a lot. I had set up camp on someone's property without realizing it. Maybe the person from last night had been the owner, or someone living nearby who didn't want strangers around. That thought made sense, but what didn't make sense was the way they behaved. Why not just yell or make their presence known? Why sneak around my tent 2 nights in a row? Why leave that drawing? I didn't have answers, and at that point I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. The drive back to the main road took longer than I remembered. The dirt path was rough and narrow, bordered by thick brush. At one point I had to stop because a tree had fallen across the road. It looked like it had been cut recently, not from a storm. The cut was clean, fresh, and right in the middle of the road, blocking the way. My heart started racing again. Someone had intentionally dropped it there. I got out of the truck and looked around, but the forest was silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. I dragged the smaller branches away and used my hatchet to break off some of the thicker limbs until I could drive over part of it. The whole time I felt like I was being watched. The feeling was so strong that I kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. When I finally made it back to the main highway, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in 2 days. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, which was about 30 miles away. I parked there for a while, just sitting in the truck trying to calm myself down. There was dirt all over my clothes, my hands were shaking, and I realized I hadn't really eaten since the night before. That night I stayed in a cheap roadside motel. The place was quiet, and even though the bed was uncomfortable, I slept deeply. The fear and exhaustion had drained me. When I woke up the next morning, the whole thing felt like a bad dream, until I noticed something on the passenger seat of my truck. It was that same folded piece of paper with the crude drawing on it. I don't know how it got there. I had locked the truck before going into the motel. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, nothing moved except that one piece of paper. The same uneven circles for eyes, the same line for a smile. My stomach twisted as I held it. The edges were crumpled now, as if someone had handled it roughly before leaving it there. I threw it out and drove straight home that morning without stopping. I didn't tell anyone what happened for weeks. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone at the gas station was messing around, maybe it wasn't the same paper. But deep down I knew it was. The way it was folded, the size, even the faint smudge near the corner, it was the same one. For months after that, I avoided going anywhere alone. I even stopped hiking for a while. Every time I heard footsteps behind me, even in a city, I tensed up. I changed locks at my apartment twice, just in case. It took me almost a year to go camping again, and even then, I only went to official campgrounds with other people nearby. I still think about that night sometimes, about the sound of those slow footsteps circling my tent, the breathing right outside, The way that drawing looked under the rock. I think whoever that was didn't just want me gone. They wanted me to know that I was being watched, and the more I replay it in my mind, the more I realize something else. Those footprints didn't just come from the trees. On the second night, they came from the stream. Whatever or whoever had been watching me had walked straight through the water silently until they reached my tent. That means they'd been there the whole time, waiting, listening, maybe watching me from the darkness while I sat by the fire. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. All right, I'll write a first-person, realistic, long 5,000+ words scary camping story about a random scenario. No ghosts or fantasy, no dialogue, simple everyday English, extremely detailed and with a clear, satisfying ending, all in one continuous piece. The creek behind the pines. I'd been planning a solo camping trip for weeks, mostly because I needed time alone. My work had been burning me out, and my sleep had been terrible for months. I wanted to disconnect from everything, stay away from people, and just be in a quiet place where all I could hear was wind and water. I picked a spot in the northern part of the state, a forested area I had only read about online. It wasn't a popular campground, just a small section of public land that allowed dispersed camping. It had a narrow creek running through it, surrounded by pine trees so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. The drive took me about 6 hours. The last half hour was rough, mostly gravel and dirt winding through a thick green blur of trees. My car bounced over roots and rocks, and I had to stop twice just to make sure I wasn't scraping anything important underneath. I reached the spot in the late afternoon. The air smelled sharp and clean, and the forest was completely silent except for the faint gurgle of water somewhere beyond the trees. I parked near a small clearing just off a dirt trail. The grass was tall and soft, and there were signs of other campers before me. Flattened patches of ground, a blackened circle where a fire pit had been made, and a few cigarette butts scattered around. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. I unpacked my gear, set up my tent, and took a slow walk to explore the area. The air felt heavier the deeper I went into the woods. The pine needles under my boots made a dry, crunching sound, and the smell of sap and soil mixed in the air. About 200 feet from my tent, the ground dipped slightly, and I found the creek. It wasn't very wide, but it moved quickly over smooth rocks, clear enough to see small fish darting near the bottom. That first night felt peaceful. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat by it as the forest grew darker. The air cooled down fast, and I could hear the wind sliding through the tops of the trees. At some point, a snapping sound in the distance caught my attention, but it wasn't unusual. Animals move around all the time at night. Still, it reminded me how far I was from anyone. I sat quietly for a long time, just listening to the sounds of the forest, the soft rush of water, a distant owl, and the rhythmic chirping of insects. When I finally went inside my tent, I fell asleep faster than I expected. I woke up once during the night to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, but it was slow and deliberate, like someone stepping on dry branches. My heart picked up immediately. I held my breath and listened. The movement stopped and everything went quiet again. After a few minutes, I heard it once more, this time closer near the fire pit. I stayed still, too afraid to move. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I waited until I couldn't hear anything anymore, and eventually drifted back to sleep, though it was light and restless. The next morning, I stepped out and saw footprints in the soft dirt near my fire pit. They weren't clear enough to tell much, but they looked human. I crouched down, studying them for a moment. The heel and toe shape were obvious, but I couldn't tell how big they were. I looked around and saw another partial print leading toward the tree line. Maybe a hiker had passed by during the night, though that didn't make much sense. There were no lights, no voices, and the nearest trailhead was miles away. I brushed it off. Maybe the prints had been there before I arrived and I just hadn't noticed. After breakfast, I spent the day hiking deeper into the woods. I followed the creek for about an hour, occasionally stepping over rocks and tree roots, just enjoying the quiet. The deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. The forest grew denser, and sunlight barely filtered through the pines. I saw a few fallen logs, Old tree stumps covered in moss and what looked like the remains of a campsite. An old tarp torn to pieces, a rusty can, and a plastic water bottle half buried in dirt. It looked like someone had been there years ago. I took a few photos, then turned back before it got too late. When I returned to camp, something felt off. My tent flap was open. I knew I had zipped it shut before leaving. My backpack was leaning against the tent differently, as if it had been moved. My stomach tightened immediately. I stepped closer and checked inside. Nothing seemed missing, but my sleeping bag had been unrolled. My cooking utensils were still there, my flashlight, everything. Still, someone had definitely gone through my things. I checked around the site for fresh footprints, but the ground was uneven, full of pine needles and hard to read. I couldn't tell if someone had been there recently or not. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was still early. I didn't want to panic over something small. Maybe I had left the flap open myself. Maybe I just didn't remember right. I forced myself to calm down, gathered some wood, and started another fire as the sun began to set. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every sound made me tense up. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of black trunks fading into shadow. That night, I barely slept. The noises came again. Slow movements, snapping twigs, and what sounded like someone breathing near the edge of my tent. I didn't move. I just lay there staring up at the thin fabric above me, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I gripped my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. At one point, something brushed against the tent wall near my feet. I froze completely. It lingered for a second, then moved away. After what felt like hours, the sounds faded and I stayed awake until dawn. When I stepped outside in the morning, my fire pit was a mess. The stones I had arranged around it were scattered, and one of my boots was lying several feet from the tent. My small folding knife, which I kept beside me while sleeping, was gone. I searched the whole area for it, but couldn't find it anywhere. That's when I realized I wasn't alone out there. Someone was messing with me. Not an animal, someone. I decided to leave that day. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear back into my car with shaking hands. Before getting in, I took one last look at the woods. The trees stood completely still, not even a hint of wind moving through them. But I had this heavy feeling that someone was watching me. I drove away fast, following the narrow dirt trail until I reached the main road. The moment I hit pavement, I finally breathed properly again. But as I drove, something in my rearview mirror caught my eye. For a split second, I thought I saw a person standing near the edge of the woods where the trail met the road. They were still facing toward me. I blinked, and when I looked again, they were gone. I told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks, but my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. I reached the nearest small town about an hour later and pulled into a gas station. I went inside, grabbed a drink, and tried to calm myself down. The man at the counter mentioned that a few hikers had gone missing in that area over the years. He said it like it was just small talk, but it hit me hard. I didn't say anything, just nodded and left. I spent that night at a cheap motel, unable to shake what had happened. I barely slept again. Not because of noise this time, but because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of someone standing by my tent, just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from the dark. I thought about those missing hikers and wondered what had actually happened to them. I told myself I was lucky to get out when I did. Over the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept going over the details, how my tent flap had been opened, how my things were moved, how my knife disappeared, and those slow, careful footsteps circling my tent. Whoever it was, they were patient. They weren't trying to rob me. They were trying to scare me, or maybe they were waiting for the right moment. A week later, I decided to check the photos I had taken on my hike. I wanted to remind myself that maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. The pictures were mostly trees, the creek, and the old torn tarp I'd found. But as I scrolled through them, one photo made me stop cold. It was a shot of the creek, taken from about 50 feet away. In the corner of the frame, barely visible between two trees, was a figure. It looked like a man, wearing dark clothes, standing completely still, facing the camera. He was far back, almost hidden by the shadows, but he was there. I stared at it for a long time. My hands went numb. I didn't remember seeing anyone that day. I hadn't heard footsteps or voices. I was completely alone, or at least I thought I was. The realization made my stomach twist. That person had been watching me long before I noticed anything wrong. He probably followed me back to my campsite that evening. Maybe he was the one who opened my tent, who took my knife, who stood outside my tent that night. Maybe he had been in the woods the whole time, waiting for me to leave, or worse, waiting for me not to. I deleted the photo, but it didn't help. Every night after that, I kept imagining those woods, that figure standing silently behind the trees. I started locking my windows at home even during the day. Small noises around my house would make me jump. Once I thought I saw someone standing near my backyard fence after dark. I had been planning that camping trip for months. It wasn't meant to be anything special, just a few days away from work, a quiet place to clear my head, somewhere far from the noise of the city. I didn't even pick a famous spot. I just looked at a map one night, found a large patch of forest near a lake about 3 hours north, and decided that was it. I wanted complete isolation. No marked trails, no campgrounds, no nearby cabins, just trees, water, and silence. I packed everything carefully. My old tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, food that could last 4 or 5 days, my fishing rod, a small hatchet, a lantern, and my first aid kit. I even brought an extra power bank and flashlight batteries. I checked everything twice before leaving. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just one coworker who I mentioned it to casually in passing. I figured that was enough. I didn't want anyone calling or checking in. I wanted to be alone. The drive up there was long and quiet. The roads narrowed as I got deeper into the forest, and my phone signal dropped to 0 about halfway through. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road, the kind where branches scraped the side of your car and potholes made you slow to a crawl. I parked near what looked like a faint trail, though it was probably just an animal path. I grabbed my backpack and gear and walked in deeper until I found a small clearing near the lake. It was perfect. The water was calm, with a light mist rising from the surface. Tall pine trees surrounded the area, their trunks dark and rough, and the smell of damp soil hung in the air. The silence was so deep that even small sounds, like the zip of my tent or the crunch of my boots, felt too loud. I set up my tent facing the lake, gathered some dry wood, and built a small fire pit out of stones. It felt peaceful, the kind of peace that city life never gives. That first evening I made some noodles, drank a can of soda, and just sat there watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned orange and then deep purple. I stayed up until the stars came out thick and bright, the kind you never see under city lights. When I finally lay down in my tent, it was dead silent. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves and the soft movement of the lake water. I slept better that night than I had in months. The next morning I woke up early and went fishing. I walked along the edge of the lake where the ground was muddy and cold. My breath made small clouds in the air. After a while I caught 2 small fish, enough for breakfast. I cleaned them, cooked them over the fire, and felt a kind of quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. But around noon, I noticed something strange. Across the lake, about 200 feet away, there was a small patch of disturbed ground. The grass looked trampled, and a few branches were broken, like someone or something had been moving through there. I thought maybe a deer had passed by, but what caught my attention was a faint piece of blue fabric stuck on a low branch. It looked like a piece of clothing. I didn't think much of it at first. People must have come through here before me. Maybe campers or hunters. Still, I decided to check it out later. For the rest of the day, I walked around the area, took photos, and gathered more wood for the night. When evening came, I could still see that patch of disturbed ground across the water, and something about it bothered me. The next morning, I packed a few essentials, a knife, some water, and my flashlight, and decided to cross to the other side of the lake to take a closer look. The air was colder that day. I followed a narrow animal trail around the lake's edge until I reached the spot. The ground was indeed trampled, and there were footprints, some human, some not. The human ones were odd. They weren't recent, but they were deep. like someone had been carrying something heavy. I followed the prints a little deeper into the woods. After about 50 feet, I found what looked like the remains of an old campfire. The ashes were scattered, and the stones around it were still blackened. There was also an empty tin can, rusted from rain, and part of a torn tarp caught under a fallen branch. It looked like someone had camped there a long time ago and left in a hurry. The thing that really unsettled me was the smell. Faint but noticeable. A sour, rotten odor like something that had been wet for too long. I assumed maybe an animal had died nearby. I decided to leave it alone and go back. When I returned to my side of the lake, the sky had already turned gray. The air felt heavy, and by evening it started to drizzle. I spent the night inside my tent listening to the rain tapping against the fabric. I must have dozed off around midnight, but I woke up suddenly later. No idea what time it was. The fire outside had died down, and the only sound was rain and wind. Then I heard something else. Faint, irregular, like a soft crunch of footsteps on wet ground. I froze. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It came from the direction of the lake. It stopped for a few seconds, then started again, slow, uneven. I held my breath and listened. After a while, it faded away. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But even after it stopped, I couldn't sleep. The silence felt heavier, like the whole forest was listening with me. The next morning, I stepped out and checked the area. The rain had turned the ground into soft mud, and near the edge of my campsite, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Human footprints. They were faint but clear enough to see the heel and toes. They came from the direction of the lake and stopped just a few feet from my tent, then turned back. There were no other signs, no dropped items, no tracks leading away except those returning to the water's edge. I stared at them for a long time. Someone had been standing just a few feet from where I slept. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. I packed some of my stuff just in case I decided to leave early. But as the hours passed, I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe another camper who had wandered nearby. The forest plays tricks on people. Sounds travel strangely through the trees. By nightfall, the air felt colder than before. I sat by the fire longer than usual, feeding it with more wood, keeping it bright. Every few minutes, I looked toward the lake, half expecting to see movement. But there was nothing, just the reflection of the flames on the still water. When I finally went inside my tent, I kept the flashlight close to me. I left the fire burning low outside. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every rustle made me tense up. Hours passed slowly, and at one point I thought I heard something moving again. This time on the opposite side of the tent. Just a faint scrape like a shoe brushing against dirt. I lay still, barely breathing. It stopped after a while, and I didn't hear anything else. I must have drifted off at some point because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. My fire was completely out, but something was wrong. My backpack, which I had left right outside the tent flap, was open. My water bottle was missing, and the small hatchet I used for chopping wood was gone too. That was it for me. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed everything as quickly as I could. Every sound in the forest suddenly felt louder and closer. The crack of branches, the rustle of leaves. I could feel eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. I carried my stuff back toward where I'd parked the car. The trail felt longer this time. Every few minutes I looked behind me. Nothing. But when I reached the spot where I had left the car, I froze again. There were fresh footprints in the mud near the driver's side door, barefoot, human, and large. The driver's side mirror was also tilted down like someone had moved it. My heart was pounding. I dropped my gear, got into the car, and locked the doors immediately. I sat there for a few seconds, just staring at the tree line. Nothing moved, no sound. Just that same heavy silence. I started the engine and drove out of there as fast as I could without wrecking the car. The dirt road felt endless. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't stop. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't even breathe properly until I was halfway back to town. That night, when I finally got home, I unloaded everything and noticed something that made me feel even worse. My sleeping bag had a faint, muddy handprint on it, on the side that faced away from me when I slept. It wasn't mine. The size, the angle, none of it matched. For days after, I couldn't sleep right. Every sound at night made me jump. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. Whoever was out there didn't attack me, didn't take much, but they had been close, watching, waiting. Maybe they were living out there, surviving off scraps, moving through the woods quietly enough that people never noticed. I told myself I wouldn't go camping alone again, at least not anywhere that remote. But sometimes when I think about that night, I remember that sour smell near the other campfire site, the one I thought was from an animal. I wonder if it wasn't old at all. Maybe it was fresh. Maybe I wasn't the first one to set up camp near that lake. Maybe someone else never made it back to their car. And maybe whoever left those footprints came back to see if I would stay longer. I went camping alone last summer. Something I had done many times before, but that trip changed how I see the woods forever. I've always liked the quiet, being away from everything, away from noise, away from people. I thought a few days in nature would clear my head. I picked a random spot I found while scrolling through maps one night, somewhere deep inside the national forest in Montana. There weren't many reviews or pictures, but that's what drew me to it. I wanted isolation. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind moving through trees. I packed my old camping gear, a small green tent, my sleeping bag, a portable stove, a few cans of beans, a flashlight, and a hatchet. I also brought my camera, thinking maybe I'd take some photos of wildlife. I left early in the morning, around 6 a.m. The drive took almost 6 hours, most of it through narrow roads that twisted through pine-covered hills. The deeper I went, the more everything around me felt untouched. The air smelled sharper, the trees grew denser, and cell service disappeared completely. When I finally reached the dirt road leading to the spot I marked, it was rough and filled with potholes. My tires kicked up dust that hung in the air behind me like smoke. The road went on longer than I expected. Almost 20 minutes of slow driving until it ended in a clearing. It wasn't an official campground, just an open patch surrounded by tall spruce trees and thick undergrowth. I liked that. There were no signs of other people, no fire pits, no trash, nothing. I parked, stepped out, and just listened. The silence was deep, broken only by distant birds and the faint sound of leaves shifting in the wind. I set up camp near the tree line where the ground was flat. The air was cooler under the shade, and I could see a narrow path leading further into the woods. It looked like an animal trail, thin and uneven, vanishing between the trees. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting everything up, pitched the tent, gathered some dry branches for firewood, and checked my gear. I had enough supplies for 3 nights. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast. The forest got darker in a way that made it hard to tell where things ended. I made a small fire and heated up a can of beans. The smell of the smoke mixed with the cool air. It was peaceful. I remember leaning back against my backpack, just staring at the orange glow of the fire reflecting off the trees. That kind of calm is something you can't find in a city. I stayed like that until the fire turned to embers, then crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. That first night I couldn't sleep well. Every sound felt too loud, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, something small moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just animals, maybe raccoons or deer. Around midnight I woke up again to what sounded like footsteps, slow, heavy, and uneven. They stopped near my tent. I froze. My breathing got shallow and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I waited for a few minutes. Then I heard them again, moving away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my flashlight in my hand until the sky turned pale gray with morning light. When I stepped outside, I half expected to see footprints, but the ground was covered in pine needles. Nothing clear. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it must have been a deer wandering close. I spent the morning hiking a bit around the area, following that narrow trail I had noticed. It wound deeper into the forest, past tall ferns and fallen logs covered in moss. I followed it for about half an hour until it opened into another small clearing. There was something strange there. An old wooden structure, maybe what used to be a hunting cabin. It was half collapsed, covered in vines and leaning to one side. I went closer and saw old rusted metal tools scattered around. The wood was gray and splintered from weather. I didn't go inside, it looked like it could fall any second. What caught my attention, though, was a pile of bones near the side. Not human, but definitely from animals. Maybe deer or elk. They were arranged strangely, like someone had collected them. It didn't look natural. I backed away slowly. The longer I stood there, the heavier the silence felt. I turned around and walked back to my camp without looking back. The rest of the day was calm, but I couldn't stop thinking about that old cabin. I didn't like the idea of someone or something collecting bones like that. I tried distracting myself, took some photos of the trees and streams nearby, cooked dinner early, and tried to sleep before it got fully dark. The wind picked up that night, brushing the sides of my tent. Around midnight again, I woke to that same sound of movement outside. This time it wasn't just footsteps. I could hear something dragging across the ground, like a rope or a branch being pulled. It circled my tent slowly. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath. My flashlight was under my pillow, but I didn't dare turn it on. After what felt like 10 minutes, the sound faded into the woods again. The next morning, I found faint marks on the ground near my tent. Long, shallow lines in the dirt leading toward the trees. I couldn't tell what made them. I started to think maybe I wasn't alone out there. Maybe some hunter. Maybe even someone living off the grid nearby. The thought made my stomach tighten. I decided that if anything weird happened again that night, I'd pack up and leave at dawn. I spent most of that third day staying close to camp. I didn't want to go wandering too far. The air felt heavier that day, humid and still. Even the birds were quiet. Around late afternoon, I noticed a shape between the trees. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but when I looked longer, I could see a figure, standing still, half hidden behind a trunk. I blinked and it was gone. My throat went dry. I stood there staring for a long time, but nothing moved again. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me or if someone was actually out there. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark with my flashlight off, just listening. The forest felt alive, every sound sharper than before. Around midnight, it started again. Slow footsteps moving closer. This time, they didn't stop at my tent. They circled twice, then I heard the faint sound of breathing, very close. I clenched the handle of my hatchet, barely breathing. After a while, the sound faded again into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the tent walls. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. The air was cold and damp. I walked a few steps and froze. In the dirt right next to my campfire pit, there were footprints. Bare feet. They weren't animal prints, they were human. I followed them with my eyes as they disappeared into the trees. That was all I needed to see. I packed everything in silence, fast. I didn't care if I forgot something. I just wanted to leave. As I loaded my things into the car, I looked once more at the path leading into the forest. I swear I saw movement again. A flicker of something pale between the trees, like someone standing there watching. I didn't wait to find out. I got in, started the engine, and drove out as fast as the dirt road allowed. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. It took me a long time to calm down after that. Weeks, maybe months. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe someone else had been camping nearby and wandered through my sight at night. But the more I think about those bare footprints, the dragging sound, the strange arrangement of bones near that old cabin, the more I know it wasn't just coincidence. I looked up that area again a few months later, just out of curiosity. There's no official record of any cabin or trail in that exact spot. It's not on the maps anymore. Some parts of the forest are marked as restricted access due to old mining activity. Maybe that's true, or maybe someone didn't want people going there anymore. Either way, I haven't been camping alone since then. I still think about that night sometimes. The sound of something dragging around my tent, the feeling of being watched, the quiet breathing outside the thin layer of nylon. I realize now how fragile isolation really is. You think you're alone out there, but you never really are. I decided to go camping alone for a few days to clear my head. It had been a rough year. Too much work, too much noise, too many people. I wanted silence. I found a spot deep in the mountains, a few miles from any known campsite. The area wasn't listed on maps. I found it while scrolling through some hiking forums where people shared off-trail locations. It was described as peaceful, quiet, and untouched. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove there early one morning with my car packed full of supplies: tent, sleeping bag, small gas stove, and enough food for 4 days. The drive took me through long stretches of forest roads that narrowed until they became nothing more than dirt paths, surrounded by thick pine trees. The air felt colder the deeper I went. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires echoed between the trees. I didn't see another vehicle the whole way, which was both peaceful and a bit unnerving. When I finally reached the end of the trail where cars couldn't go any further, I parked and began to hike with my backpack. The trail wasn't marked, but I followed a faint path made by animals or old campers. The forest felt heavy with silence. The only sounds were my own footsteps, the wind brushing through the branches, and the occasional creak of a distant tree. After an hour or so, I found a flat clearing near a small stream. It looked perfect: soft ground, enough open space for my tent, and a natural barrier of trees around me. The stream was clear and cold, flowing gently over smooth rocks. I set down my pack and started setting up camp. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, gathered some firewood, and boiled water for coffee. The sun was already high, but the tall trees filtered most of the light. I could feel the temperature drop as soon as the wind picked up. Once everything was ready, I sat beside the fire and listened. The woods were incredibly still. Even the birds seemed quiet. For a while, that silence felt comforting. I had no service, no notifications, no one around. Just the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was exactly what I came for. As evening settled, I cooked a simple meal and sat watching the fire. The forest changed with the light. It grew darker, thicker, more alive. The stream sounded louder. The trees creaked more often, and faint noises came from deep in the woods. I tried to tell myself it was just small animals moving around. I had been in forests before. I knew how loud they could get at night. But there was something about being completely alone that made every sound feel heavier. By the time the fire burned low, I decided to sleep. The night air had turned cold enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the stream outside. It took a long time to fall asleep, but I eventually drifted off to the steady rhythm of running water. I woke up in the middle of the night for no clear reason. The fire was out and everything was pitch dark. I could only see faint outlines of the tent walls from the moonlight outside. I stayed still, trying to listen. The forest was silent, completely silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, but that silence felt wrong, unnatural, like everything was holding its breath. Then I heard a sound. It wasn't loud, just faint crunching, like footsteps moving slowly through dry leaves. I tried to tell myself it could be an animal. A deer, maybe. But the steps were too careful, too evenly spaced. They paused, then started again, closer this time. My heart started racing. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear the soft shifting of dirt. I held my breath and waited. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I didn't even want to move. After what felt like a full minute, I heard the sound again, retreating this time, fading into the distance. I stayed awake for hours after that, staring into the dark, my ears tuned to every small sound. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back to sleep. In the morning, I got out of the tent and checked around. The ground near the tent was disturbed. I could see prints in the dirt, not deep but definitely human, barefoot. I followed them for a few feet until they disappeared near the stream. The water had probably washed away the rest. I told myself maybe they were old tracks. The forest had hikers occasionally, even if it didn't seem like it. Still, something about the shape of those prints stayed in my mind all day. I spent most of the second day trying to relax, fishing in the stream, hiking a little further up the slope. The woods felt quieter than usual, as if everything was listening. The air felt heavier, colder. Even the sunlight looked dim. I tried to shake off the unease, but it stayed with me. I couldn't stop glancing toward the tree line. That night, I kept the fire burning longer. I wanted light, warmth, anything to make the dark less heavy. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting toward the edge of the light where the trees began. The forest looked endless in every direction. When the fire finally burned down, I added more logs. The wood cracked loudly, echoing through the trees. That sound gave me a small sense of control, like I was reminding the forest I was still there. Around midnight, I heard it again, the same slow movement through the leaves, but this time it didn't stop near the tent. It moved in a wide circle around the camp. I could hear branches snapping softly, leaves shifting under careful steps. It circled for a long time, 10, maybe 15 minutes. I froze in my tent again, gripping the handle of my knife. The sound eventually faded toward the direction of the stream, and I didn't hear it again that night. When the sun came up, I looked around again. This time I saw more footprints. They weren't mine. I had been wearing boots. These were the same bare ones as before. They came from the woods, circled the camp, and went back the way they came. I noticed that some were fresh, pressed into the damp soil near the water. I felt a wave of unease crawl up my spine. Someone had been out there watching. Moving quietly through the trees while I slept, I decided to pack up that morning. I wasn't going to risk another night there. I started gathering my things quickly. As I took down the tent, I realized something else. The food container I'd sealed and set aside had been moved. It wasn't far, just shifted about a foot to the left, but I knew I hadn't touched it. Maybe it was nothing, but combined with everything else, it made me move faster. I loaded everything back into my pack, doused the fire, and started hiking back toward the trail where my car was parked. The forest felt different in daylight, still quiet but tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. Every time a twig snapped or a bird flew off suddenly, I froze. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been near my camp that night. After about 40 minutes of walking, I reached a point where the path became hard to follow. The woods here looked similar in every direction. I was sure I'd come this way before, but the landmarks didn't match. The fallen log I remembered seeing wasn't there, and the slope of the ground felt steeper than before. I pulled out my compass and map, but the needle spun slightly, not settling in one direction. I adjusted and tried again, but the readings made no sense. I decided to keep moving downhill, thinking I'd eventually reach the forest road. Hours passed. The sun began to lower, and I realized I was going in circles. The trees looked familiar, but slightly off. I hadn't seen the stream again either, even though I knew it should have been nearby. The feeling of being watched grew stronger the longer I walked. The forest was too still. Not a single bird, not even wind. Just the sound of my own footsteps. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I stopped near a large rock formation to rest. My legs ached and my throat was dry. I had some water left, but I didn't want to waste it. As I sat there, I noticed something half buried near the rock. A torn piece of fabric, faded and dirty. It looked like part of a shirt. I moved closer and saw more. An old boot, a metal water bottle covered in rust, and what looked like part of a tent pole. The gear was decayed, maybe years old, but it was clearly camping equipment. I felt my stomach twist. I checked the boot. It was small, like it belonged to a woman or a teenager. The fabric had no markings, nothing to identify who it belonged to. I didn't want to think about what might have happened here, but the pieces fit together too neatly. Someone else had camped in these woods before, someone who didn't leave. As the light began to fade, I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't stop now. Every direction looked the same, but I kept heading downhill, hoping to find the forest road. The deeper the shadows grew, the more the forest felt alive again. Branches creaked, leaves rustled faintly, and once I thought I heard breathing behind me. When I turned, there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. By the time night fully fell, I still hadn't found the road. I had no choice but to stop. I didn't set up the tent. I just sat with my back against a tree, knife in hand, and waited for dawn. I barely blinked that night. I could hear distant sounds through the dark, slow, dragging steps moving somewhere nearby, sometimes stopping, sometimes starting again. When morning came, I moved immediately. My eyes felt heavy and my whole body ached, but the need to get out was stronger. Around mid-morning, I finally heard something familiar, the faint trickle of the stream. I followed the sound until I reached it. The sight of that water nearly made me cry. I knew if I followed it downstream, it would eventually lead to the road. I walked along the edge for hours until I finally saw the dirt path where I'd parked my car days ago. The relief that hit me,